In the long memory of the ancient world, there are stories that move like distant thunder across forgotten ages. They speak of a time when the earth carried beings of unusual stature, tribes whose height and strength shaped the fears and hopes of early generations. Their footprints are faint now, buried beneath the slow weight of soil and centuries. Yet their presence lingers in scattered lines of sacred writing, in the quiet warnings whispered by prophets, and in fragments of texts guarded with care. These stories are neither loud nor boastful. They rise gently from the deep past, as though the earth itself has kept them in trust. Before the turmoil of kingdoms, before empires drew borders upon stone, there were days marked by a different struggle. The skies watched a world where strength was prized above wisdom, and where the boundaries between heaven and earth stood troubled. The rise of the giant tribes is told not as a tale of triumph, but as a sign that something within creation had drifted. What does it mean when a people grow mighty in form, and yet distant from the order that once held all things in balance? What hidden patterns shaped their days, and why did heaven number them with such care? The ancient record speaks softly, hinting at origins shrouded in mystery and destinies bound to judgment. Some passages describe them as the offspring of unions not meant to shape the world. Others present them as guardians turned to violence, forgotten rulers whose strength became their undoing. In each telling, there is a sense of weight, as though their story is not only history but instruction. Their rise, their wandering, and their end trace a quiet line through sacred memory. And even now, their presence calls for reflection. What happens when creation strains against its appointed boundaries? What warnings remain for later generations who carry the same restless heart? This journey follows the slow unfolding of that ancient story, a path through origin, rebellion, consequence, and the long silence that followed. It moves gently, as night settles, toward understanding rather than certainty. For some tales are not given to answer every question. They simply invite a deeper listening. In the ancient silence before memory, the early world rested beneath a calm and measured order. The foundations of creation were set with care, shaped not in haste but in gentle intention. Light and darkness moved in steady rhythm. Waters rose and fell in quiet obedience. The fields held their seasons, and every living creature followed its appointed path. The early earth did not strain against itself. It carried a harmony that seemed as natural as breath, and the days unfolded like a slow and unbroken song. Sacred writings from distant ages describe this beginning not as a moment of brilliance alone, but as the formation of a balanced design. Strength and gentleness were woven together. Rest and labor held equal place. Even the spaces between things carried purpose, for the empty places were as meaningful as the filled. The early world felt held, guided by an unseen structure that kept each part in its place. The winds did not wander without cause, and the shadows did not reach beyond their boundaries. It was a world where creation seemed newly awake, still close to the intention that first shaped it. Within this ordered realm, humanity took its first steps. Ancient texts portray early humanity as beings who lived in quiet closeness to the natural world, moving through landscapes that bore the freshness of their origin. The ground had not yet grown weary beneath their feet. Their lives unfolded in simplicity, marked by the rising sun and the turning seasons, guided by rhythms that required no struggle to understand. Their presence did not disturb the earth. They were part of its design, placed within a structure already complete. Above this early humanity, heavenly beings, described in several traditions as watchers or guardians, observed with steady purpose. Their role was not to rule but to preserve. They watched the unfolding of creation, ensuring that each order remained intact. Their presence was quiet, not demanding attention, yet their watchfulness formed an unseen boundary around the world. They were part of the harmony, keeping the balance between the seen and the unseen. For a time, that balance held firm. The early world appeared still, untroubled by change. Yet within this stillness, certain signs began to rise, small, subtle, and easily overlooked. Ancient writings hint at moments when the rhythm shifted, not in great storms or sudden upheaval, but in the faintest tremors beneath the surface of life. A choice made without wisdom, a longing that reached beyond its place, a boundary approached with unfamiliar curiosity. These signs did not yet break the order, but they revealed that creation carried the potential for divergence. Different cultures preserve traces of this early shift. Some speak of a restlessness that grew within certain hearts. Others describe a faint distancing from the original harmony, as though the thread that held creation in unity had begun to loosen in one small place. The disturbances were not loud. They did not reshape the land or darken the sky. Instead, they moved silently, like a ripple beneath still water, unnoticed by most but no less real. The early world remained outwardly peaceful, yet its silence began to change in tone. What had once been pure stillness now carried an undercurrent of expectation, as though creation sensed a turning approaching from afar. The days remained bright, the nights clear, but something had shifted in the depth of things. The world stood upon the threshold of a story not yet revealed. Although no great upheaval had occurred, the stage was being quietly prepared. The foundations remained, but the first strands of tension began to weave themselves into the fabric of the earth. The harmony was not broken, but it was no longer unquestioned. Something subtle, yet significant, was gathering at the edges of creation. The early world continued to rest beneath a sky that seemed unchanged, yet the quiet alterations within creation began to deepen. These shifts did not appear in the natural order, for the sun still traced its measured arc, and the seasons moved with faithful certainty. Instead, the change stirred within the unseen workings of intention, purpose, and desire. Such movements were gentle at first, subtle enough to escape notice, yet they marked the beginning of a journey that would shape all that followed. Humanity, still young upon the earth, began to sense a widening within the boundaries that once felt firm. Life had been simple, defined by labor, rest, and the quiet companionship of creation. Yet as the early generations grew, so too did their awareness. Their thoughts stretched toward questions not yet formed, and their hearts drifted toward desires not yet weighed. This inner expansion was neither wrong nor sudden. It was part of the natural unfolding of human nature. But in certain moments, it pressed against the boundaries woven into creation, testing limits that once seemed clear. Heavenly beings watched this unfolding with steady intention. Their role had never been to restrain humanity. Instead, they observed the growth of a species given freedom within order. Across ancient writings, these watchers are portrayed as guardians, set not to interfere but to preserve balance. They moved in silence above the earth, upholding the structure that held all things in place. Yet even their watchfulness could sense the faint shifting patterns. What had begun as a ripple now resembled a slow turning beneath the surface, a quiet divergence from the harmony that shaped the world's first days. Traditions across regions and eras record hints of this early disturbance. Some speak of a moment when the boundary between the seen and unseen seemed thinner, as though the two realms leaned closer than before. Others describe an awakening of curiosity within the heavenly beings themselves, a curiosity that later writings recall with solemn caution. These traditions do not frame the early signs of disturbance as acts of defiance. Instead, they portray them as the first fragile movements toward imbalance. Not rebellion, but inclination. Not conflict, but the early longing that precedes it. The earth, sensitive to every subtle shift, responded with quiet awareness. Certain places felt different, as though carrying an unspoken tension. The air held a stillness that seemed deeper than before. The landscapes remained unchanged, yet something in their presence felt altered. Ancient storytellers often spoke of these early signs through imagery, fields that seemed to listen, waters that moved with heavier breath, mountains that bore witness to the turning of intention. These portrayals were not meant to suggest physical change, but to reflect the earth's role as the canvas upon which all creation's movements were felt. Though humanity sensed little of this deeper shift, certain individuals felt a quiet unease. Not fear, but a faint awareness that the harmony around them no longer flowed without interruption. These individuals did not understand the cause, for the disturbances were not yet visible. They occurred within the hidden structures of desire, curiosity, and attention, movements that would one day shape visible events. Yet in this early stage, they existed only as soft impressions upon the world. The watchers perceived these impressions more clearly. Their sight extended beyond what humanity could understand, reaching into intentions, possibilities, and the unseen pathways that branch from each choice. They noticed the growing pull between realms, a pull subtle enough to ignore but strong enough to change the shape of future days. Their task remained the same: to observe, to preserve balance, to allow creation to unfold according to the design set at its beginning. But their watchfulness grew heavier, as though they sensed a path forming that would soon require greater attention. Still, the early world held its outward peace. The rivers flowed. The winds moved with gentle purpose. Families tended their fields, gathered their harvest, and lived within the rhythm of days shaped by consistency. Yet beneath this visible calm, the story of creation edged quietly toward its first great turn. The early disturbances were small, but they were real. A subtle misalignment had begun within the harmony that once felt unbreakable. Nothing dramatic announced this shift. No voice, no sign, no sudden rupture. The early world continued in its serene unfolding, yet its stillness carried a new depth. It was the depth of a pause before movement, the breath before a story expands. All creation stood within that pause, waiting without knowing it. The boundaries that once held the world in perfect balance began to loosen, almost imperceptibly, preparing the way for changes that would soon reshape the land. The early world moved forward in its quiet rhythm, yet the faint disturbances continued to weave themselves into the deeper fabric of creation. The shifts were not violent. They carried no sound, no tremor, no shadow. They appeared instead as gentle realignments, changes that could only be sensed in the stillness between moments. This was a stage in which the world did not break, but began to lean in a new direction, slowly, delicately, almost invisibly. Humanity lived through this unfolding without understanding its weight. Daily life remained simple, shaped by tasks that needed tending and seasons that returned with steady faithfulness. People raised their shelters, cultivated their fields, and rested beneath skies unchanged in their beauty. Yet even within this ordinary activity, something subtle began to stir. The early generations experienced a growing awareness of themselves, a widening of their inner world. Their minds reached beyond their immediate surroundings. Their thoughts wandered toward questions that had no roots in memory. This quiet turning of thought was natural, yet it marked the beginning of a separation between humanity and the perfect simplicity of its earliest days. Ancient writings describe this period with calm reflection. They speak of humanity standing at the threshold between innocence and insight, carrying both the gift and burden of understanding. This new depth within the human heart allowed for greater wonder, but also carried the seeds of desire that could stray from the order established at creation. The early world did not resist these changes. It received them with the same patience that marked all of its beginnings, but the harmony within creation began to bear the weight of these shifting intentions. High above the earth, the watchers observed these developments with unwavering attention. Their role had been clear from the beginning: to guard the order of the world, to stand as witnesses between the realms, and to uphold the balance that shaped creation. They watched humanity with a mixture of solemnity and purpose, understanding that growth brings both clarity and risk. As humanity's awareness deepened, The watchers sensed the boundaries between heaven and earth easing in ways not originally intended. These boundaries did not tear or collapse, but softened, an effect subtle enough to pass unnoticed, yet strong enough to change the path of future generations. Certain accounts describe this early period as one in which curiosity began to flow more freely between realms. Humanity looked upward with increasing wonder, while heavenly beings felt a stirring of interest toward the life unfolding below. These movements were gentle, neither rebellious nor alarming, but they marked a departure from the original stillness. The early world, once perfectly aligned with its intended order, now carried the first signs of divergence. The land itself seemed aware of these shifts. Though unchanged in form, it held a new depth in its silence. The forests carried a listening stillness. The mountains seemed more watchful. The valleys felt imbued with expectation. These portrayals, found in ancient storytelling traditions, reflect the understanding that the earth is never untouched by the movements of spirit and intention. Even the smallest change in the unseen realm leaves an echo upon the natural world, subtle but enduring. As these early disturbances grew, they did not bring conflict or decay. The world remained whole, yet its harmony no longer rested in effortless balance. It required greater care, greater attention, and greater understanding. The watchers maintained their vigil, aware that a path was forming that would eventually lead to greater challenges. Humanity continued its quiet life, unaware that its own growth had begun to reshape the horizon of future ages. These developments formed the unseen foundation for all that would follow. The rise of powerful beings, the shifts between realms, and the stories preserved in sacred memory all trace their beginnings to this early moment. The world was not yet troubled, but it was no longer untouched. The first strands of tension had entered creation, preparing the soil in which later events would take root. The early world stood in this delicate balance, still beautiful, still serene, yet filled with a quiet expectancy. The stage was set, though no one upon the earth knew it. The signs of disturbance were small, but they carried within them the shape of a story that would unfold slowly across ages. All creation rested within this calm turning, held in the gentle pause before the deeper movements of history began. In the quiet expanse between heaven and earth, there existed a realm of order older than memory. Within this realm moved the Watchers, beings of steady purpose whose gaze rested upon the world below. They were not rulers, nor were they distant observers. Their presence served as a bridge between realms, upholding the harmony woven into creation's earliest design. Each watcher carried a role shaped by wisdom, and their watchfulness formed an invisible boundary that preserved the balance of all living things. For ages uncounted, this order remained unbroken. The Watchers observed humanity as it grew, learned, and shaped its way of life upon the earth. Their interest was gentle, marked by a calm guardianship that neither interfered nor withdrew. The distance between realms held firm, maintained by a structure that guided every movement of the unseen. Yet within this structure, something quiet began to stir, a turning so subtle that only the deepest traditions preserved its memory. Sacred and apocryphal writings speak of this turning with solemn restraint. They describe not a sudden revolt, but a slow and inward shift of intention. Certain watchers, drawn by the growing depth within humanity, allowed their attention to linger more closely upon the lives unfolding below. This was not itself a breach, for curiosity had always been part of their nature. Yet the line between observation and longing is thin, and in the stillness of their watch, that line began to soften. The early world, sensitive to movements within the unseen realm, felt the first trace of this shift. Nothing changed upon its surface. The rivers continued their course, and the fields brought forth their harvests. Yet a faint tension formed within the boundary that separated the heavenly from the earthly. It was not a tear, but a gentle yielding, a sign that the perfect order of creation carried within it the possibility of change. Ancient accounts differ in detail, yet all agree on the central theme. The descent of the Watchers was not an act of force. It unfolded like the slow leaning of intention, a quiet step taken after many silent moments. The Watchers did not fall from heaven. They moved toward the earth with deliberate calm, guided not by defiance, but by a desire that grew slowly until it could no longer remain contained within the boundaries set for them. Their descent marks one of the great turning points in sacred memory, yet the tone in the old texts is never harsh. It is reflective, measured, aware that even choices which strain the order of creation exist within a purpose beyond full understanding. The Watchers crossed a boundary, but they did not shatter it. They stepped into a realm not meant for their dwelling, and in doing so, opened a path that would allow vast changes to enter the world. The earth felt their arrival as a shift in its deep places. The air grew heavier with meaning, as though charged with a presence too great for its delicate balance. Ancient storytellers describe mountains that seemed to listen, and valleys that held their breath. These images are not meant as literal events, but as reflections of the weight the descent carried, a moment when the harmony of creation trembled not in violence, but in anticipation. The Watchers did not wage war upon heaven, nor did they seek to overthrow the design entrusted to them. Their turning was more subtle, grounded in curiosity, longing, and the desire to understand a world that fascinated them. Yet in stepping beyond their appointed boundary, they initiated a ripple that would spread through creation in ways they could not foresee. Their descent became the hinge upon which later histories would turn, including the rise of powerful beings whose presence would reshape the earth. This moment stands at the center of many traditions for a reason. It was the quiet breach that allowed later events to unfold, not in chaos, but in accordance with a pattern that acknowledges both freedom and consequence. The Watcher's descent reveals that even within divine order, the choices of beings with intention carry profound weight. Their movement toward Earth did not break creation, but it altered its path, gently yet irrevocably. The descent of the Watchers continued with the same quiet gravity that marked its beginning. It was not marked by thunder or flame. No sign appeared in the heavens to announce their movement. They came softly, with the restraint of beings who understood the weight of every step. Yet each step carried them farther from the realm of their origin, guiding them toward a world that had never been shaped to hold their presence. Their approach altered nothing in appearance, but everything in essence. A boundary that once stood firm now gave way beneath a gentle, deliberate touch. Ancient writings portray this crossing as a moment layered with meaning. It is described not merely as a physical descent, but as a shift in the very fabric that separated the heavenly from the earthly. Why the Watchers carried with them a purity of origin, a strength woven from the order they once maintained. But the earth was a realm of growth, mortality, and desire. When the Watchers took their first steps upon its soil, two different forms of creation stood closer than ever before. It was this closeness, not violence or rebellion, that allowed new possibilities to take root. Humanity, unaware of the cosmic weight of this moment, continued in its daily rhythm. Yet some felt an unspoken presence settle over the land. The early world seemed more alive, more attentive, as though the unseen had drawn nearer. The Watchers moved among the hills and valleys with quiet intention, observing the patterns of human life from a vantage closer than ever before. Their attention deepened into understanding, and understanding into a form of attachment that had never been part of their purpose. Sacred texts speak of this deepening with careful language. They describe Watchers who became captivated not by power, but by the unfolding of human life, its fragility, its beauty, its struggles, and its simplicity. These writings do not speak of corruption in its earliest form. They speak of beings drawn toward a world that stirred emotions and thoughts that had no place in the order they once upheld. Desire did not erupt suddenly. It formed slowly, born from observation, from admiration, from the quiet pull of a life unlike their own. This longing marked the true breaking of boundaries. It was not the descent itself that reshaped creation. It was the shift within the Watchers' intentions. As their attachment deepened, they moved further from their original purpose. The boundaries they crossed were not only those dividing heaven and earth, but those within themselves. The structure that once held their intentions steady began to soften, allowing choices that had not existed in the earliest days of creation. The earth responded to this turning in ways subtle but profound. Traditions describe the land as sensing the weight of new presence, as though the soil itself recognized beings who carried the radiance of another realm. The presence of the Watchers did not disrupt the visible order, but it filled the world with a tension that felt both sacred and fragile. This tension did not stem from conflict. It stemmed from the fact that the Watchers' presence in the earthly realm was not part of the balance originally woven into creation. The Watchers, in stepping beyond their appointed place, created a hinge in the story of the world. Before their descent, creation followed a path shaped by purity of intention and unbroken order. After their descent, a new path emerged, one shaped by choices, consequences, and the blending of realms. This was not chaos. It was not collapse. It was the opening of a door through which new forms of life and knowledge would pass. The ancient writings treat this moment with solemn reverence. They do not speak of accusation or anger. Instead, they describe the descent as part of a larger design, one that acknowledges the freedom of created beings to choose their path. Even the Watchers, formed for a purpose higher than human understanding, carried within themselves the potential for turning. Their choices became part of creation's unfolding story, guided not by rebellion, but by the natural consequences that follow when boundaries yield. This understanding is essential, for it shapes how later events are remembered. The Watchers did not descend to destroy. They descended because their hearts turned toward something beyond their purpose. Their descent opened the way for beings whose existence would reshape the earth, but the responsibility for this unfolding rested not on malice, but on the quiet shift of intention that led heavenly beings to step into a realm not meant for their dwelling. As this turning deepened, the path ahead became clearer. The Watcher's presence upon the earth would bring knowledge, power, and influence not intended for early humanity. Yet in these early movements, nothing of that had yet occurred. The story remained in a state of quiet tension, poised between realms, awaiting the deeper consequences of the boundary that had begun to break. The descent of the Watchers had begun as a quiet turning, but its presence within the world slowly deepened into a lasting breach, one that would reach far beyond the gentle footsteps that carried them down from their appointed heights. The early earth, still calm in its outward appearance, now held within it a new and delicate tension. A realm once separated by design from the heavenly became a meeting place between intention and desire, between purpose and curiosity. The Watchers did not yet act in ways remembered as transgression, yet their very presence signaled that a boundary woven into creation had loosened in a way that could not be reversed. Traditions describe the Watchers walking through the early world with a mixture of awe and quiet wonder. The Why moved among the valleys, watched the rivers trace their courses, and observed humanity at its tasks. For the first time, they were not distant guardians looking upon the earth through the veil of separation. They were witnesses from within the world, feeling its breath, sensing its weight, and seeing its beauty with a closeness never intended for them. Their admiration deepened into attachment, and attachment into a subtle longing that shaped their choices in ways that would ripple through ages. This longing became the center of the boundaries breaking. It was not born from ambition or resentment. It arose from encountering a world filled with forms of life that carried a depth the Watchers had never experienced. Humanity's fragility, its rhythms of labor and rest, its quiet joys, and its deep vulnerabilities awakened within the Watchers an awareness that did not belong to their nature. Some ancient accounts speak of heavenly beings who felt drawn to the mortal world not because they sought power over it, but because they saw in humanity something they could not fully comprehend. The Watcher's descent was thus not a single act but a progression of choices. Each choice took them further from the structure of obedience that once shaped their existence. They stood between realms, their nature belonging to the heavenly, yet their attention drawn to the earthly. This divided state became the true breach, not a tear in the fabric of creation, but a quiet dissonance within the beings charged with its protection. The world, sensitive to every subtle shift within the unseen realm, bore the weight of this dissonance. The harmony that once rested upon creation now carried a faint strain. The land did not rebel, and the skies did not darken, but a deeper tension settled into the foundation of things. Ancient storytellers describe the early world as holding its breath during this period, sensing that the presence of the Watchers, though calm and gentle, had moved creation away from its original balance. It was in this atmosphere of quiet tension that the next stage of the unfolding story began to take form. The Watchers, now fully present upon the earth, carried knowledge shaped by realms humanity had never seen. Their understanding of the cosmos, of the structure of creation, and of the mysteries woven into existence itself was vast. Yet this knowledge, when held within a realm not meant to bear it, created a pressure that would eventually reshape the world in lasting ways. The Watchers did not intend to cause disruption. Many accounts describe them acting with restraint, observing humanity with care and fascination. But intention cannot always restrain consequence. Their presence marked a turning that allowed new forms of interaction between the heavenly and the earthly, a turning that opened the way for profound change. This change would one day give rise to beings whose might and stature exceeded anything the early world had known. But at this early stage, the movements remained hidden, forming quietly within the deeper structures of creation. Thus, the descent of the Watchers stands as a hinge in sacred memory. Before their descent, creation rested upon an unbroken order. After their descent, the path of history carried within it the imprint of their choices. The breach they opened was not violent, but its effects would echo across ages. Their turning revealed that even heavenly beings, formed for purpose and guided by wisdom, could step beyond the boundaries set for them, not through rebellion, but through the slow unfolding of desire. Yet even in this breaking of boundaries, the world was not abandoned to chaos. The ancient texts portray a creation still held within a larger design, one that could encompass even the choices of the Watchers. The descent did not end the order of creation. It reformed it, setting the stage for events that would lead to the rise of powerful beings whose story would mark the earth with lasting memory. In the quiet aftermath of the Watchers' descent, the early world entered a new and solemn phase. The boundary between heaven and earth, once firm and luminous, had softened. From this softened boundary came consequences not immediately visible, yet destined to shape the memories of countless generations. Among these consequences was the emergence of beings described in sacred and ancient writings with a tone of awe, caution, and profound weight. These were the giants, tribes of unusual stature and strength, whose very presence marked a departure from the harmony that once guided creation. Their beginnings are spoken of sparingly in the oldest texts, as though the chroniclers themselves approached the subject with reverence. The writings do not present the giants as creatures of mythic invention, but as part of a larger unfolding set in motion long before their appearance. Their origin followed the pattern shaped by the Watchers' turning, a pattern that allowed the realms to mingle in ways never intended. The giants emerged from this mingling, carrying within their nature a trace of the imbalance that had entered creation. Their birth did not come as a sudden eruption upon the earth. It unfolded quietly, as many deep shifts do. Early communities would have witnessed them with a mixture of wonder and unease, for these beings bore forms that stood apart from all others. Their height rose above the tallest men. Their steps carried a weight that pressed into the soil. Their strength, beyond common measure, shaped the way they moved through the world. Yet despite these extraordinary traits, their early presence carried no triumphant tone. The writings describe them not as rulers or heroes, but as signs, living reminders that a boundary had been crossed. At first, the giants inhabited isolated regions, moving through landscapes vast and untamed. They roamed the great plains where the horizon stretched unbroken. They traversed hillsides later remembered for their fortified heights. They walked near ancient stones whose arrangement remains a mystery to later generations. The early world was wide, and these tribes moved across it with a mixture of purpose and restlessness. Their wanderings were neither conquest nor exploration. They reflected a deeper searching, as though the giants themselves sensed the imbalance within their own existence. Communities that encountered them did so with caution. The giants' size alone set them apart, but it was not only physical difference that shaped human response. Something within their presence carried a weight that seemed to press upon the air. Ancient accounts portray early peoples standing at a distance, watching these tribes pass through valleys and across riverbanks. The giants were not uniformly violent, yet their appearance brought an undeniable sense of uncertainty. Their existence seemed to speak to a breach in the world's structure, one that humanity could observe but not understand. Even the land responded to their movements. Paths became deeper where they walked. Stones shifted beneath their steps. Settlements shifted position to avoid the routes the giants followed. Villages formed near natural barriers, cliffs, rivers, or dense forests, places where the giants' great size became a disadvantage. The shaping of these early settlements, recorded in fragments of tradition, reveals how human life adapted to the presence of beings whose existence carried both awe and unease. Despite their extraordinary strength, the giants' story is not one of rising glory. It is marked instead by a quiet heaviness. Their birth carried the weight of imbalance, and their early movements reflected it. They existed between the realms, born of a moment when the natural order had shifted, and carrying within themselves the evidence of that shift. The giants were beings of great presence, yet they moved as though they bore a burden older than themselves. Their wanderings left impressions that survived long after their footsteps faded. Great stones arranged in patterns without clear explanation. Legends of towering figures who passed through the land in ages far beyond memory. Boundaries drawn around sacred hills where early communities believed these ancient tribes once walked. These remnants did not glorify the giants. They preserved the quiet warning that their existence brought into the world. Thus, the birth of the giant tribes stands not as a tale of marvel, but as a solemn chapter in the unfolding story of creation. Their emergence reveals the depth of the imbalance that had entered the world, and their early wanderings trace the paths of beings who, by their very presence, reminded humanity that the boundary between heaven and earth had been altered in ways that could not be undone. Their story begins not with triumph, but with the weight of a world adjusting to a new and lasting reality. The early wanderings of the giant tribes unfolded across landscapes that seemed shaped to bear their praise. NCE. Vast plains stretched before them like open paths, and their long strides carried them across distances that would have taken ordinary people many days. They moved through regions where the earth rose gently into broad hills, their silhouettes visible against the horizon long before their forms could be clearly seen. These landscapes, remembered later in story and memory, became inseparably linked with the passage of beings whose size and strength left marks that endured long after their lives had faded from the earth. Across different traditions, the giants are described not as conquerors but as wanderers. They followed no fixed homeland, and they built no early kingdoms. Their presence in a region was felt before it was understood. Trees leaned under the touch of their hands. Riverbanks carried impressions deeper than those left by ordinary travelers. In the earliest stages of their existence, the giants did not settle. They crossed the land as though searching for a place that could hold the weight of their being. Yet no place seemed designed for them, and this searching lent their movements a tone of restlessness. The communities they encountered reacted with a mixture of caution and curiosity. The giants' height made them visible from great distances, giving villages time to prepare. Families gathered their children and stepped back from open fields. Hunters withdrew into forest edges. Yet the giants often passed without direct interaction, moving with a silence unexpected for their size. Their journeys were steady and deliberate, lacking the aggression that would one day be associated with later generations. But even in this early state, their presence stirred unease. People felt in them a difference that went beyond physical strength, a difference rooted in the altered boundaries that had shaped their origin. Certain regions became closely associated with their early movements. There were lands marked by stone circles whose purpose remains unknown. Tall standing stones, arranged with deliberate care, rose in formations that suggested ancient significance. Some traditions speak of these stones as markers placed by the giants themselves, while others present them as places the giants were drawn toward for reasons that remain hidden. Whether these structures were shaped by human hands or carried older significance, their connection to the early wanderings of giant tribes became deeply embedded in the memory of the land. Other regions bear stories of fortified hills, high places strengthened with earthworks whose scale exceeds the needs of early human communities. Later generations would attribute such fortifications to the giants, imagining them as places where these beings paused in their long journeys. These connections may be symbolic rather than literal, yet they reveal how strongly the presence of the giants imprinted itself upon the landscapes they crossed. Hills that rose sharply from the plains, cliffs that held narrow paths, and valleys shaped by ancient water became woven into the memory of the giants' early movements. The giants themselves carried a presence that shaped their surroundings even without intention. Their strength was not merely physical, it felt woven into the air around them. People who observed them from a distance often described a stillness that fell over the land as they approached. Even the animals seemed to withdraw, sensing in these beings a magnitude unlike anything formed solely of earth. This stillness was not born of fear, but of recognition. The giants reflected a world that had shifted, a world where the boundary between realms had been altered in ways humanity could not articulate but deeply felt. As the giants moved through the land, their existence revealed the lingering imbalance that had entered creation. They did not act in deliberate defiance, yet their very presence carried the echo of the Watcher's choice. In the giants, the blending of realms took visible form. Their stature, their strength, and the quiet heaviness of their movements were signs of a story that began long before their birth. The giants did not choose this role, yet they embodied it, walking reminders of the moment when heaven and earth had briefly met in ways beyond their design. The early world struggled to absorb their presence. Settlements shifted toward natural defenses, rivers with swift currents, ridges too narrow for large beings to cross easily, forests dense enough to conceal smaller communities. Over time, patterns of dwelling changed. Villages rose in places where giants were unlikely to pass. Paths were marked not by written language, but by knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. These adjustments were not born of panic, but of adaptation. Humanity learned to live alongside beings whose origins lay beyond the familiar boundaries of creation. Even so, stories began to take shape. Parents told their children of great figures who walked the land in ancient days. Travelers spoke of valleys where the earth held footprints too large to belong to any ordinary creature. These stories did not exaggerate the giants, they sought to understand them. The early world was filled with questions, and the presence of the giants gave form to mysteries that could not yet be answered. Thus, the early wanderings of the giant tribes became part of the landscape itself, shaping memory as much as terrain. Their presence neither conquered nor destroyed, yet it changed the way people saw the world. The giants were reminders of a turning that had already begun, a turning within creation that could not be reversed. They were beings of immense strength, yet they carried the burden of imbalance, reflecting a story that would unfold slowly and deeply across generations. As the wanderings of the giant tribes continued, their presence became a quiet force shaping the early world in ways more enduring than their footsteps alone. They did not seek dominion over the land, yet the sheer magnitude of their being altered the patterns of life around them. Valleys they crossed became places of whispered memory. Plains where they once walked gained a solemn reputation. Even years after their passing from a region, communities would speak of their presence as though it remained in the very soil. The giants left impressions not only in the earth, but in the consciousness of those who lived alongside them. Ancient storytellers describe these early tribes with a tone of awe tempered by unease. Their strength set them apart, but it was not strength alone that shaped how they were remembered. The giants carried an air of distance, as though they belonged partly to the world and partly to something beyond it. Their steps held power, yet their faces often appeared reflective, almost solemn. Their origins lay in a breach between realms, and something of that breach remained within their bearing. They did not fully belong to the world they walked upon, and this sense of displacement lingered around them like a quiet echo. Communities that watched them from afar struggled to interpret their movements. Some saw them as omens, signs that creation had changed in ways not yet understood. Others regarded them as wanderers whose path through the world reflected a deeper imbalance. Many simply observed them with caution, recognizing that these beings, though not immediately hostile, lived outside the natural order. Their presence felt like a reminder that something within creation had drifted from its original harmony. Over time, as the giants roamed across different regions, their paths shaped the future of human settlement. The earliest villages began to avoid wide, open plains, preferring the protection of high ground or dense forests. Families built their homes near natural barriers, steep cliffs, narrow river crossings, and stone ridges, to ensure safety in the event that giants passed nearby. Even though many giants did not seek conflict, the prospect of crossing their path instilled a quiet fear. Humanity adapted its way of life not through direct confrontation, but through thoughtful withdrawal. In certain regions, traditions speak of giants pausing for long periods in places where the land felt ancient and strong. These locations later became sites wrapped in reverence or caution. Some were marked by massive stones whose placement seemed beyond human ability. Others were high hills fortified far beyond the needs of ordinary communities. Whether these constructions were truly the work of giants or simply associated with them through story, they became symbols of the early wanderings, visible reminders of beings whose existence challenged the boundaries of the world. As generations passed, memories of the giants intertwined with the landscapes they had traversed. Stories formed around their presence, shaped not by exaggeration but by the solemnity of ancient experience. People spoke of deep footprints left in hardened earth, of stones moved with ease, of shadows cast across valleys that seemed to stretch longer than the day itself. These stories were not tales of triumph or terror. They were expressions of a world grappling with beings who bore the weight of a broken boundary between heaven and earth. The giants themselves carried this weight. Their existence reflected the subtle fracture within creation, a fracture born from the Watcher's descent. Though the giants did not fully understand their role, they bore the burden of imbalance in their bodies and in their presence. Their strength, though immense, could not free them from the unease that shaped their nature. They were beings born of a turning not their own, walking through a world that could neither contain nor ignore them. In time, the early wanderings began to fade, leaving behind only traces. The giants moved into deeper wildernesses and distant regions where fewer communities lived. Their paths became lonely, stretching across remote valleys and unbrock. In plains, humanity saw less of them, and the land they once crossed grew quiet again. Yet the memory remained. Even as the giants stepped beyond the edges of settled regions, their presence continued to shape how people understood the world. They had become symbols, not of power, but of imbalance, beings whose existence pointed back to the moment when boundaries had first begun to break. These memories endured long after the early giants themselves had vanished from familiar lands. The stones they touched, the plains they crossed, and the hills they lingered upon all became part of a story that communities passed down through generations. Parents told their children of ancient tribes whose size and presence marked them as different from all others. Elders spoke of days when the earth felt heavier, when the sky seemed closer, and when beings of immense stature walked between the realms of the seen and unseen. Thus, the birth and early wanderings of the giant tribes became woven into the long memory of the world. Their story was not one of conquest or glory, but of presence that revealed the depth of imbalance that had entered creation. They were reminders of a turning that began long before their birth, and of a world adjusting to the quiet consequences of a broken boundary. Their footsteps faded, but the memory of them endured, shaping the land, the people, and the stories that carried their echo across generations. In the quiet years that followed the early wanderings of the giant tribes, a new and solemn shift began to move across the earth. It did not come with the sound of battle or the rise of kingdoms. It came instead through knowledge. Knowledge passed from the Watchers to the giants, and from the giants to the early generations of humanity. This knowledge did not enter the world as a deliberate act of defiance. It emerged through the same slow turning of intention that had once drawn the Watchers down from their appointed realm. Yet its effects were deep and lasting, shaping the earth with a weight that grew heavier as the years unfolded. Ancient writings speak of this knowledge with measured caution. They describe mysteries taught in moments of quiet instruction, crafts of metal and stone, arts that shape the appearance of the body, understandings of the heavens, and workings of the earth that reached beyond the simple rhythms of early life. These teachings, though impressive in form, were not rooted in wisdom. They were fragments taken from a realm where purpose and intention were perfectly aligned, and placed into a world not prepared to bear them. The knowledge arrived without the structure that made it safe, and thus it became a burden rather than a gift. The giants received these teachings first. Their minds, shaped by origins blending heaven and earth, grasped the mysteries swiftly. They learned to alter the materials of the world, to forge metal where none had been forged, to carve stone with precision far beyond the skill of early peoples. They created tools that magnified their already great strength. They shaped objects of beauty, yet beneath their beauty there rested a subtle imbalance. Every skill they gained carried within it the echo of the Watchers' broken boundary. As the giants practiced these crafts, fragments of their knowledge began to pass to humanity. The early peoples observed, learned, and slowly adopted these teachings into their lives. Yet something changed in the process. Knowledge that came from beyond the earth did not settle easily upon mortal hands. It brought abilities that exceeded the natural pace of human development. Crafts that might have taken centuries to unfold instead appeared suddenly, without the moral and communal frameworks needed to hold them. Skill, in its earliest form, became entangled with desire. Communities began to shift in response. The simple tools that once shaped daily life were replaced with sharper instruments, heavier weights, and objects that carried both usefulness and danger. Hunting became easier, but also fiercer. The building of shelters grew more efficient, Yet the same skills allowed for the building of strongholds that separated one group from another. What had once been knowledge meant for guidance now fed an emerging tension within the human heart. The giants, too, felt the burden of this knowledge. Their strength, once a sign of imbalance, now grew more pronounced. With new crafts in their hands, their presence became heavier upon the land. They carved great stones, shaped weapons beyond measure, and altered the landscapes they moved through. These creations were not born from malice, but from curiosity and power untempered by wisdom. Yet each act pressed further upon the fragile harmony of the world. The earth responded in quiet ways. Fields that once yielded with ease now grew thinner in places touched by conflict. Forests seemed restless, as though stirred by a presence they could not endure. Rivers altered their paths, carving new channels through land shaped by the giant's strength. The natural world did not reject humanity or the giants, but it carried the weight of their actions, bearing marks that revealed a deepening imbalance. Early societies watched these changes with unease. The knowledge that had entered the world reshaped their daily lives, yet it also introduced forms of tension unknown in earlier days. People began to guard what they learned, fearing what others might do with the same knowledge. Crafts that once existed to sustain life now held the potential to harm. Communities strengthened their borders, not against giants alone, but against one another. Thus, the spread of hidden knowledge brought both advancement and unrest. It illuminated the world with new possibilities, yet cast long shadows that grew darker with each generation. The knowledge did not corrupt by its essence. It became burdensome because it entered a world unready to hold it. The giants carried part of this burden, and humanity carried the rest. Together, their actions began to darken the earth, not through sudden violence, but through the gradual misuse of gifts that had crossed a boundary never meant to be crossed. In this way, the rise of knowledge became as significant to the giants' fate as their great strength. For knowledge without guidance, like power without restraint, reshapes the world in ways that cannot easily be undone. The early Earth, in CE marked by harmony, now felt the slow gathering of shadows born not from rebellion, but from a natural progression set in motion when order was first disrupted. As the hidden knowledge continued to spread, its influence deepened into the quiet corners of the earth. The Watchers had not intended for their teachings to overturn the world, yet the knowledge they imparted carried weight beyond what the early generations could bear. The giants, who first received these teachings, expanded their use of them in ways that reshaped their surroundings. Their great hands forged metals into tools and weapons of unmatched strength. Their understanding of the earth's materials allowed them to carve stones with precision that seemed impossible for any mortal being. Each new skill opened the door to another, and soon the world found itself holding a form of mastery that arrived too quickly and grew too wide. Humanity observed the giants with a mixture of admiration and quiet fear. The tools created by the giants promised abundance, greater harvests, stronger shelters, more effective ways to hunt and build. Yet the same tools could become instruments of harm. In earlier ages, conflict between communities had been limited by the simplicity of their means. But as new materials and methods spread, the nature of conflict changed. Disputes once settled through words or simple displays of strength now held the potential for deeper violence. Skill, when untethered from wisdom, carries its own momentum, and that momentum began to move through the world with growing force. Ancient writings reflect this shift through calm but steady warnings. They describe the multiplication of knowledge without the multiplication of understanding. Crafts that once served only the needs of the day expanded into arts of adornment, enchantment, and separation. Knowledge of appearance and ornamentation, meant to reflect beauty, grew entangled with vanity and rivalry. Knowledge of metallurgy, meant for sustenance and work, became intertwined with the longing for dominance. knowledge of the heavens, meant to offer understanding of seasons and cycles, became twisted into practices that pulled attention away from the humility of daily life. The giants themselves were not immune to these turns. Their strength gave them advantage, and their knowledge magnified it. As they crafted tools of immense power, their movements across the land began to take on a new tone. Where once they had wandered in restless searching, now their presence held the potential for influence that could not be ignored. They stood apart not only in form, but in knowledge. The early earth sensed this growing weight, and the balance within creation shifted once more. Human settlements adapted quickly. Some communities sought to learn as much as possible, hoping to strengthen themselves. Others withdrew from places where giants lived or passed, seeking simpler regions where the older rhythms of life still prevailed. Fear did not dominate these decisions, but caution did. People understood that the giants, guided by knowledge not meant for the world, had become unpredictable. A single misunderstanding, a simple conflict, could now carry consequences far greater than anything known in earlier generations. The earth bore the marks of these developments. Forests were cleared to make room for structures strengthened by newly discovered techniques. Hills were carved and reshaped by giants whose tools cut stone with ease. Rivers were redirected to suit new needs, altering the natural flow of life in ways that affected entire regions. The land grew heavier, not in darkness alone, but in burden created by the sudden rise of skill not tempered by wisdom's slow and steady hand. Sacred texts speak of this period with a tone of quiet sorrow. They do not blame the giants or humanity. Instead, they observe the natural progression that occurs when order is disrupted. Knowledge, separated from the intention that once guided it, becomes a tool that shapes the world according to the desires of those who wield it. And desire, when not bound by balance, grows in ways that outpace understanding. The early earth, once marked by simplicity, now held a mixture of brilliance and danger. The giants felt the tension more deeply than humanity did. Their great strength, magnified by their growing knowledge, placed a weight upon them that few could comprehend. They were beings between realms, shaped by forces that had never been intended to meet. As they expanded their skills, they also expanded the distance between themselves and the harmony that creation once held. Their story, already solemn, now carried the burden of power without peace. Communities began to speak in softer tones about the changes in the world. They observed shifts in the behavior of animals, the resilience of crops, and the patterns of seasons. Whether these changes were connected to the knowledge being misused, or whether they acted a natural response of the earth to imbalance, the effect was the same. Life grew heavier, more complex, and less certain. Thus, the spread of hidden knowledge did not darken the world through sudden destruction. It darkened the world through gradual consequence. The early earth, receiving teachings before its time, held the weight of advancement without the foundation of wisdom. This weight grew quietly, touching every aspect of life, shaping both the giants and humanity in ways that neither group fully understood. As the generations unfolded, the burden of hidden knowledge settled more heavily upon the world. The early earth, once shaped by harmony and simple rhythms, now bore the imprint of skills and mysteries that had entered before their proper season. Nothing changed in a single moment. Rather, the darkening of the earth emerged as a gradual deepening, a quiet spreading of consequences born from knowledge used without the structure that made it safe. The giants, who had been the first recipients of these teachings, stood at the center of this unfolding weight. With each passing year, their creations grew in scale and complexity. Stones were lifted and set into formations whose purpose was unclear even to those who built them. Metals were shaped into tools of immense power. Mixtures of herbs, minerals, and oils were discovered, substances that affected the mind and the body in ways that drew both fascination and caution. The Watchers had once understood these mysteries within the clarity of their own realm. But within the earthly world, removed from the harmony of their origin, the same mysteries grew unstable. Their use without proper guidance created results that neither giants nor humans could fully predict. The giants themselves began to feel an inward unsteadiness. They had been formed from a boundary already broken, and the knowledge they received magnified this fracture. Their strength increased, but their peace diminished. Their understanding broadened, but their restraint weakened. Some traditions recount moments when giants acted suddenly, driven by impulses they did not fully comprehend. Not all such actions caused harm, yet each revealed a deeper truth. Beings created from imbalance carry that imbalance within themselves. Knowledge does not heal such fractures, it amplifies them. Humanity observed these shifts with growing unease. Communities that had once merely adjusted their settlements to avoid the giants now faced the consequences of knowledge that had entered their own hands. A sharpened blade offered protection, yet also temptation. A technique that allowed stone to be shaped for shelter also allowed it to be shaped for barriers. The line between need and desire blurred. Skill became a mark of strength, and strength became a mark of dominance. These changes did not sweep across the world all at once. They moved slowly, carried by subtle decisions made each day. The natural world responded in ways that echoed the growing imbalance. Fields that once yielded freely required greater labor. The patterns of animals shifted, with some avoiding regions touched by the giants' activities. Forests grew quieter in places where metalwork had become common. Rivers, altered by early engineering, brought both benefit and unforeseen trouble. Floods struck places that had once remained dry. Dryness touched places that had once been fertile. These changes, though not catastrophic, created a sense of uncertainty that spread through communities like a low and distant rumble. Ancient writings describe this period as a time when the earth itself grew heavy. The phrase does not refer to weight in a physical sense, but to the atmosphere of unsettledness that settled upon creation. Knowledge had expanded far beyond its intended boundaries. People saw its power, but they also felt its shadow. The giants sensed this shadow more deeply still. Their bodies, shaped to hold both strength and imbalance, responded sharply to the strain. Their movements grew less peaceful. Their emotions grew more volatile. Their presence, once merely unsettling, now seemed to carry a restlessness that the world could not ease. Some communities attempted to withdraw from the spreading influence. They returned to simpler ways, avoiding the tools and teachings that carried the scent of imbalance. Others embraced the new skills, hoping to strengthen themselves in uncertain times. These differing responses created quiet divisions between groups that once lived in close harmony. The world became a place where paths diverged not only in culture, but in moral direction. Skill without guidance created the illusion of strength, yet it weakened the bonds that held early communities together. The giants, caught between realms in their very nature, stood at the heart of these developments. Their use of knowledge magnified the world's unease, yet they were also shaped by the very imbalance they intensified. Their story was no longer simply of wandering beings set apart by stature. It had become the story of creatures burdened by gifts they could not master. Their strength, once their most obvious trait, now became intertwined with a deeper fragility. For the more they learned, the further they drifted from the harmony that once marked the early world. As the earth darkened under the weight of misused knowledge, a sense of inevitability began to settle upon creation. The darkening was not violent but persistent. It flowed quietly, like a shadow that lengthened with the turning of the sun. Knowledge, separated from purpose, created consequences that neither giants nor humans could escape. The world moved toward a point where the imbalance would demand response, not through sudden judgment, but through the natural progression of a creation seeking to restore its lost harmony. Thus, the spread of hidden knowledge contributed to the fate of the giants as surely as their great strength did. Their downfall was not written in a single act of violence, but in the quiet accumulation of choices, teachings, and consequences that reshaped the earth over time. The darkening was not condemnation. It was the natural unfolding of a world carrying weight it had never been meant to bear. And in the deepening shadows of those days, the path toward the giants' eventual fall began to take form, not through might, but through the burden of knowledge misaligned with wisdom. As the years continued their slow procession, the world entered an age remembered in sacred writings as a time of deepening corruption. The early harmony of creation, already strained by the spread of hidden knowledge, now weakened under the growing presence of the giant tribes. These beings, once wanderers marked by restlessness, had grown into figures whose strength shaped the fears and memories of all who lived near them. Their power, magnified by knowledge that had entered the world before its time, began to influence the rhythms of life in ways that could no longer be ignored. Communities that once adapted quietly to the giants' movement now found themselves overshadowed by their expanding dominance. The giants no longer walked the earth as solitary wanderers. They gathered into clans whose presence carried the weight of authority. Their stature alone made them formidable, but it was their growing certainty of power that shaped the atmosphere of the age. Ancient traditions describe them with both awe and dread, for their actions reflected a world drifting further from its intended balance. The giants' strength, once neutral, now shaped their decisions. Their voices grew louder, their tempers quicker, and their disputes more destructive. Conflicts that might have remained small between ordinary people became devastating when giants were involved. Trees were uprooted in their anger. Stones were cast aside. Settlements found themselves caught in disputes that had nothing to do with them, yet left marks upon the land that lasted for generations. These disturbances were not always born from malice, but from beings whose power exceeded their restraint. The earth, fragile beneath their heavy steps, carried the scars of their presence. As conflict grew, so did unease. People withdrew from regions where giants gathered, choosing to settle farther away in remote valleys and hidden plains. These migrations reshaped the patterns of life across the ancient world. Villages formed in secluded places. Paths changed direction to avoid the territories claimed by giants. Stories spread through the land, carried in hushed tones by travelers who spoke of towering figures whose strength had become unpredictable. The giants did not set out to rule the earth, yet their presence created an atmosphere where fear settled deeply into the heart of humanity. The giants themselves were shaped by the world's decline. Their nature, born from a breach between realms, held within it a tension that grew sharper as the earth darkened. Knowledge gained from the Watchers magnified their impulses, and the increasing unrest among humans fed their own volatility. They stood as both cause and reflection of the world's imbalance, embodying the widening gap between creation's intent and creation's condition. Their strength intensified, but their inner stability frayed. They lived in a state of constant tension, caught between the pull of earthly desire and the echo of a realm they could never return to. Ancient writings describe this age as one in which violence filled the land. This violence did not arise solely from the giants, yet their presence amplified it. Ordinary disputes became battles. Simple misunderstandings grew into long-standing grievances. Communities built walls not only of stone, but of distrust. This was not merely an age of physical conflict. It was an age in which the moral fabric of the world began to unravel. The giants, with their immense presence, became symbols of this unraveling. Their existence revealed the depth of the earth's decline, for they embodied the consequences of a boundary broken long before. Despite the growing corruption, the tone of ancient texts remained solemn rather than sensational. They describe a world moving steadily toward imbalance, guided by the natural progression of choices, desires, and consequences. The giants' actions, though often destructive, are portrayed within this broader context. They were not monsters beyond reason. They were beings shaped by forces greater than themselves, living in a world already turning toward its own rebalancing. The early world sensed this approaching shift. The cycles of the earth began to feel heavier. Seasons took on a tone of unease. Rivers that once flowed steadily carried the impression of something unsettled beneath their depths. These observations, passed down through generations, reflect the perception that creation itself was preparing for correction. The giants stood within this expectation, their presence both a sign of the earth's imbalance and a catalyst for the judgment that approached. Thus, the days before the flood were marked not only by outward violence, but by an inward unraveling, an erosion of harmony, purpose, and restraint. The giants' growing dominance revealed how far the world had drifted. Their strength, no longer tempered by any boundary, became a mirror of creation's widening fracture. Their story in this age cannot be separated from the story of the earth's decline, for the two moved together, step by heavy step, toward a moment when the balance of creation would demand restoration. As the age deepened, the presence of the giants became woven into the daily life of the world. No region where they walked remained untouched by their influence. Their size, their strength, and the unchecked power they carried shaped the land in ways that surpassed the ordinary struggles of humanity. Yet their dominance did not arise from deliberate conquest. It grew from the simple fact that their existence pressed upon a world already drifting from its intended order. As the earth strained under this weight, the giants became both participants in the growing corruption and markers of its presence. Their gatherings formed territories where few dared to dwell. These territories were not kingdoms in the formal sense, yet they held the authority of presence alone. Great plains where giants hunted became places avoided by travelers. Valleys where their clans settled became regions marked with caution. Paths once used for trade or migration shifted away from these domains. People learned to read the land with care, recognizing the subtle signs that giants had passed nearby. Disturbed soil, broken trees, stones turned from their resting places. These signs carried meaning, warning communities to keep their distance. The giants themselves grew increasingly shaped by the world's unrest. As knowledge spread without restraint, and as human life grew more tumultuous, the giants absorbed the atmosphere of conflict around them. Their immense bodies seemed to carry the tension of the age. Disputes between giants escalated quickly, ending in destruction that reshaped the land. Their tempers flared with greater ease, their impulses sharpened by the imbalance within creation. Some ancient accounts describe the sound of their anger rolling across valleys like distant thunder, a reminder that the greatest dangers of the age often began with quiet provocations. Human communities, already troubled by their own growing disputes, interpreted the giants' volatility through the lens of fear. Stories emerged of individuals who dared to stand against a giant and were swiftly swept aside. These stories, passed from one village to another, magnified the sense of dread that surrounded the giant's presence. Yet even in these accounts, the tone remains one of solemn reflection rather than accusation. The giants acted not out of inherent malice, but out of a nature shaped by imbalance. Their strength intensified their weaknesses, and their weaknesses shaped the fear that spread across the earth. Over time, the giants' dominance began to alter the structure of early societies. Villages built closer together for protection. Entire communities migrated to distant regions where giants were seldom seen. Generational memory developed around the knowledge of where giants lived and how they behaved. This memory shaped traditions, stories, and the rhythm of life itself. Children were taught from a young age to avoid certain lands, and elders recalled earlier days when the world had felt lighter, simpler, and less burdened by the presence of beings who walked with such overwhelming strength. The giants, in turn, became increasingly isolated. Their interactions with humanity diminished, not because of their deliberate withdrawal, but because the world around them had shifted. The land grew more fractured. Human life became more guarded. The giants moved among territories that felt emptier than before, wandering through regions where fewer communities remained. This isolation deepened their restlessness. Their nature, already unstable, grew more unpredictable, shaped by a world responding to their presence with fear and distance. Ancient texts describe this age with a tone of mourning. They speak of violence filling the earth, not only between giants and humans, but between humans themselves. The giants stood as towering reminders of the broader corruption that had spread across creation. Their presence amplified the violence of the age, yet they were also its symptoms. Their story cannot be separated from the story of humanity, for both arose from the same imbalance that had entered the world when boundaries had first been crossed. The earth itself responded to these developments. Rivers carried silt stained with the remnants of conflict. Forests grew sparse where giants passed. Wildlife moved in patterns that showed fear, avoiding regions touched by destruction. The natural world reacted not through sudden upheaval, but through quiet shifts that revealed the cumulative weight of unrest. These reactions became part of the broader sense that creation was straining under forces it could no longer harmonize. The giants, though powerful beyond measure, were not immune to this strain. Their bodies bore signs of the world's decline. Their movements grew heavier, their spirits more troubled, their temperaments more volatile. They sensed the tension in the earth, the unease in the air, and the growing dissonance in the hearts of humankind. Yet they could not escape their role within this unfolding age. Their existence had become intertwined with the corruption of the world, making them central figures in the landscape of approaching judgment. As the days moved steadily toward the flood, the giants stood as both catalysts and indicators. Their strength, once a marvel, had become a signal that creation was drifting farther from the balance originally set for it. Their actions, whether deliberate or unintentional, revealed the deep fractures spreading through the world. And though they remained unaware of the cosmic shift drawing near, their presence pressed upon the earth with a weight that reflected the urgency of the coming rebalancing. As the age drew nearer to its turning point, the presence of the giants became inseparable from the atmosphere of decline that had settled upon the world. Their immense forms moved across a land that had grown weary, and their actions echoed the increasing distance between creation and the harmony that once defined it. The giants did not stand outside the world's corruption. They were woven into it. Their very existence reflected the imbalance that had taken root, growing deeper with each passing generation. The giants' conflicts intensified in these later days. Their disputes, once rare and contained, now expanded into fierce struggles that shook the earth. They clashed with one another over territories, resources, and pride. When giants contended, the land bore the marks for decades. Trees splintered, hills altered, and ground scattered as though plowed by storms. These battles were not movements of conquest. They were expressions of a growing unrest within beings who had been shaped by a fractured order. Their great strength magnified every impulse, and the turmoil within the giants mirrored the turmoil within the world. Humanity, caught within the same age of decline, suffered deeply from the consequences of this unrest. Villages that once thrived in open lowlands now fled to high places, building dwellings on cliffs and fortified hills for safety. Some communities abandoned fertile lands because giants had claimed them. Others moved continually, never remaining long enough for the land to become home. The early earth, once a place of steady rhythms, had become a place of movement and fear. This fear was not directed at the giants alone. It reflected the entire age, a time when human actions, too, grew more violent, more reckless, and more distant from the original design of creation. Ancient texts describe the world in this era as filled with violence. This description includes both giants and humans, for the corruption had touched every part of life. The giants embodied it, the humans enacted it, and the earth absorbed it. Yet even in these accounts, the tone remains reflective rather than accusatory. The giants did not cause the world's decline alone. They were part of a larger pattern, an unfolding consequence of the Watcher's descent and the knowledge that had spread beyond its intended bounds. Their presence intensified the age's unrest, yet they were also shaped by forces greater than themselves. Amid this growing turmoil, nature itself gave signs of strain. The sky seemed heavier, as though laden with unspoken tension. Storms formed with greater unpredictability. Winds carried dust across lands that once held lush growth. The rivers swelled unexpectedly in some regions and dwindled in others. These shifts were not dramatic enough to cause immediate devastation, but they revealed a world moving toward a moment of correction. Creation, once in harmony, now moved with imbalance. And the giants, with their immense presence and volatile spirits, stood as the clearest image of this imbalance. Some traditions speak of giants who became increasingly restless, wandering alone into wildernesses where even their clans would not follow. Others describe giants who sought to impose order upon their surroundings, only to bring greater destruction in the attempt. These accounts reflect the inner turmoil that marked their final days. Their strength had grown far beyond the measure of earthbound life, yet their wisdom had not. They carried the weight of power without guidance, existence without place, strength without peace. No being could endure such imbalance forever. Humanity watched these developments with a mixture of fear and resignation. The giants, once distant wanderers, had become dominant figures whose actions shaped the course of the age. But people sensed that their strength would not endure indefinitely. Stories began to circulate of signs in the sky, of the earth's growing heaviness, and of an approaching reckoning spoken of by ancient voices. These stories did not speak the language of panic. They carried a solemn expectation, a recognition that creation itself could not sustain the widening fracture within it. The giants felt this shift as well, though in ways they could not understand. They sensed the heaviness in the earth beneath them, felt the tension in the wind, and saw the unease in humanity's movements. Some giants grew more violent in response, acting from fear they could not name. Others grew more withdrawn, wandering into remote regions where no path followed. These differing responses revealed the complexity of their nature. They were neither simple beings of destruction nor creatures beyond reflection. They carried within themselves the echoes of their origin, a mixture of strength, longing, imbalance, and consequence. As creation approached its moment of rebalancing, the giants stood at the center of the world's turmoil. Their presence had become inseparable from the decline of the age. The violence that marked the era reflected not only their actions, but the broader corruption that had touched all life. The giants were part of a world unraveling, and their struggles revealed the depth of the fracture between what creation was meant to be and what it had become. The flood, though not yet described directly in these sacred accounts, approached as part of a cosmic restoration, a return to balance, not an act of arbitrary destruction. The giants' fate was bound to this turning. Their strength, immense yet unstable, could not stand against the weight of a world seeking to restore its lost order. Their downfall would not come through battle or conquest, but through the same natural progression that had shaped their rise. A progression guided by harmony disrupted and creation seeking to heal itself. In these final days before the flood, the giants remain both symbols and participants in the world's decline. Their story stands not as an isolated tale of power gone astray, but as an integral part of the broader narrative of creation's response to imbalance. Their strength had magnified the age's corruption, and the age's corruption had shaped their end. They walked heavily across the earth, unaware that every step brought them closer to the moment when creation would rise to restore its forgotten balance. In the quiet depth of sacred memory, the end of the first giant age stands as one of the most solemn moments in the story of creation. It was a time when the world, strained by imbalance and burdened by unrest, approached a point of no return. The giants, whose presence had grown into a symbol of the earth's turmoil, stood at the center of this turning. Their strength, once a marvel and later a weight, became a quiet testimony to the broken boundaries from which they had arisen. As the age neared its completion, creation itself prepared for restoration, a restoration expressed through judgment, but understood in ancient writings as a return to harmony. The flood, remembered across cultures and traditions, is often portrayed as an act of overwhelming force. Yet in the older texts, its meaning carries a deeper, more reverent tone. It is described not as an act of destruction for its own sake, but as a cleansing, a washing away of a world that had grown heavy with corruption. This cleansing was not aimed solely at humanity or the giants. It addressed the imbalance woven into every part of creation. The giants, passing in this moment, stands as part of a larger pattern, the pattern of a world seeking to reestablish the order that had once guided its earliest days. The giants did not foresee their end. Their strength, though immense, could not shield them from the shift moving through the earth. In the days before the flood, signs appeared that the world was preparing to correct itself. The ground held a heaviness that seemed deeper than soil. The skies gathered a weight not born of clouds alone. Rivers, once steady, carried a restless pulse. These signs did not arrive suddenly. They rose gently, like a tide unseen but deeply felt. The giants sensed these shifts, though they did not understand them. Their spirits, already troubled by the growing conflict of the age, felt a new and unfamiliar unease, an unease that echoed through the land they walked upon. Ancient texts describe the decision for judgment as a moment filled with sorrow rather than anger. The world had reached a point where its wounds could not heal through gradual change. A cleansing was needed, not to punish creation, but to restore it. The giants, whose origins lay in the breach between realms, were part of the imbalance that needed resolution. Their passing would become a symbol of the boundary being reestablished, of the broken harmony being renewed. When the waters began to rise, the giants faced a force unlike any they had known. Their strength, which had shaped the fears and stories of countless communities, could not withstand the vastness of the earth's restoration. The flood did not come as a battle they could resist. It came as a return to silence, a return to order, a washing away of the chaos that had settled over generations. The giants, despite their power, were swept into the same cleansing that touched every corner of the world. Their passing marked the end of a story shaped by imbalance, a story that could not continue within a restored creation. Yet their downfall was not only physical, it was symbolic. The giants had embodied the great fracture between heaven and earth, a fracture created when watchers crossed boundaries not meant to be crossed. Their existence had reminded the world of a moment when intention shifted, when knowledge spread before its time, when harmony loosened. Their passing symbolized the closing of that chapter. The world would begin again without the immediate weight of their presence, without the constant reminder of broken order. Different traditions describe the flood with varying details, yet all agree on one truth: it marked the close of an age. The first giant age ended not through war, not through rebellion, but through the natural progression of a world returning to balance. The giants' passing was part of that progression. Their footsteps, which had once shaken the earth, faded into the depths of memory. Their strength, which had shaped entire regions, dissolved into the waters that carried away the corruption of the age. The flood's purpose in these ancient texts is always framed within restoration. It washed the earth clean, not merely of violence, but of the imbalance that had entered creation when boundaries were first broken. The giants were part of that imbalance, and their passing allowed the world to stand once more upon a foundation aligned with its original design. This act of cleansing was solemn, vast, and purposeful. It carried the weight of both ending and renewal. The story of the giants does not vanish entirely in this moment. Their presence would echo in post-flood traditions, remembered in later generations through tales of scattered remnants and distant tribes. But the first age, the age that bore the weight of the watchers turning, ended silently beneath the rising waters, leaving behind a world ready for restoration. As the waters rose, the world entered a silence unlike any it had known since its earliest dawn. This silence was not the absence of sound, but the settling of a profound stillness, a stillness born from creation drawing breath for its own renewal. The giants, whose footsteps once echoed across valleys and plains, found themselves standing before a force that could not be met with strength. Their size, their might, and the knowledge they had gained could not alter the course of a judgment woven into the very fabric of existence. The rising waters moved with calm inevitability, guided not by wrath, but by the slow and solemn purpose of restoring balance. In the ancient world, storms seldom carried symbolic meaning, yet the days of the flood were remembered as a time when the heavens and the deep responded together. The skies released their rains with patient persistence, and the springs of the earth opened as though honoring a command older than memory. These movements were not described in sacred writings as acts of rage, but as gestures of cleansing, gestures through which the world washed itself of the weight it could no longer bear. The giants, bound to the imbalance that had shaped their existence, could not escape this cleansing. They were part of the world's burden, and thus they were part of the world's release. Communities that had once feared the giants now witnessed their vulnerability. In these final days, the giants were stripped of the authority that their strength had once granted them. The water rose without distinction between the powerful and the small, between those who had struggled and those who had caused struggle. The giants, despite their towering stature, faced the same rising tide that touched the hills and valleys. Some attempted to flee to higher ground, seeking safety on mountains whose peaks seemed beyond the reach of the waters. Yet the waters continued their ascent, unhurried, unfaltering, moving according to a purpose that no being of earth could resist. Ancient traditions speak of the giants' end with solemn clarity. They describe scenes in which these great beings stood upon the highest ridges, watching the waters approach, unable to shape their fate. Their final moments are portrayed not as battles, but as quiet acknowledgments of the greater reality unfolding around them. The giants had been born of broken boundaries, and now those boundaries were being restored. Their passing was not a defeat in combat, but a return to the balance that creation required. In their last hours, they stood as symbols of a chapter that could not continue into the restored world. For the earth itself, the flood became a kind of deep exhalation. The land absorbed the waters, the valleys filled, and the plains vanished beneath the rising tide. The familiar shapes of the world disappeared, only to re-emerge cleansed and reshaped once the waters began to recede. This cleansing did not merely remove corruption, it prepared the foundation for new beginnings. The passing of the giants was part of this renewal. Their presence had marked an age defined by imbalance. Their absence would allow the world to step into a new era, free from the overwhelming weight of their strength and the complexities of their origins. Those who survived the flood carried memories of the giants as part of the story of the world that had been washed away. These memories did not glorify the giants, nor did they portray them as creatures beyond understanding. Instead, the memories preserved the truth that the giants had been part of creation's struggle, a struggle between harmony and imbalance, between order and the forces that pulled against it. Their strength had magnified the earth's decline, yet their passing marked the first step toward restoration. In the generations that followed, The giant's story became a reminder of the mercy and the gravity of cosmic rebalancing. The flood did not erase their existence from sacred memory. Instead, it set the boundary that defined their significance. By allowing the first giant age to close, creation acknowledged the need to restore what had been lost. The giants had been central to the imbalance, and thus their passing became central to the healing. Even the way ancient texts speak of the flood reflects this understanding. They do not linger upon destruction, they focus on renewal. The world had grown too heavy, too fractured to sustain itself. The rising waters did not merely end an age. They prepared the world for one that could unfold without the unsteady weight that the giants, by their nature, carried into creation. The giant's passing, solemn and vast, stands within this sacred rhythm of loss and restoration. When the waters finally reached their fullness, the world entered a depth of silence that marked the true closing of the first giant age. The towering beings who had once strode across plains and valleys were gone, carried beneath the cleansing tide that washed the world of its accumulated weight. What remained was not the memory of their fall alone, but the solemn understanding that an era shaped by broken boundaries had come to its natural end. The earth, submerged in its own renewal, waited for the balance that would emerge as the waters receded. The giants' passing held meaning far beyond the loss of physical beings. Their existence had symbolized the widening fracture between heaven and earth, a fracture created when watchers stepped beyond the limits of their appointed realm. The giants were born from that breach, and their lives reflected its consequences. Their strength had magnified the world's unrest, and their struggles had intensified the corruption that already spread across early humanity. Their presence stood as a reminder of imbalance, and their absence marked the first step toward its healing. Thus, their passing was both a conclusion and a beginning, an end to a chapter of creation shaped by divergence from order, and the start of a world returning to harmony. As the waters lingered over the land, all things rested within a vast stillness. The high mountains formed islands in the sea of judgment. The winds moved softly across the endless expanse. The sky, once troubled by the turmoil of the age, hung clear and quiet. In this stillness, creation itself seemed to breathe, its wounds soaking in the cleansing depths. The flood was not merely a physical event, it was a resetting of the world's structure. The giants, bound to the imbalance that required correction, had no place in the restored order that would emerge. Their passing was the necessary close of a story that could not continue. When at last the waters began to recede, the world rose from beneath them transformed. The outlines of the land emerged slowly, shaped by the cleansing they had endured. Rivers found new paths, plains settled in different forms. Forests would one day grow where waters had once stood. The earth that surfaced carried a sense of renewal, a world no longer burdened by the overwhelming presence of those beings whose strength had pressed upon it so heavily. This renewed earth stood ready to support life again, free from the instability that had once defined the age of the giants. In this renewed world, memory became the bridge between what had been and what would come. The survivors of the flood, few in number yet entrusted with the task of carrying creation forward, held within their stories the echoes of the giants. They spoke of a time when beings of immense stature walked the earth, beings born from a moment when boundaries were crossed and the harmony of creation shifted. These stories did not serve as warnings of terror, but as reflections on the cost of imbalance. The giants' fall reminded future generations that strength without guidance could burden the world, and that even powerful beings could stand vulnerable before the natural rebalancing of creation. Yet the story of the giants did not end completely with the flood. Sacred texts and later traditions speak of remnants, beings that appeared in post-flood generations, smaller in number, scattered across the earth. These figures, though remarkable in stature or strength, did not possess the overwhelming presence of the First Age. Their existence served not as a continuation of the old imbalance, but as an echo of it. They reminded the world of what had once been, their presence marking the boundaries between past and present. The chapter that had closed beneath the waters would never fully reappear, yet its memory would shape understanding for ages to come. The passing of the first giant age stands in ancient narratives as one of the most solemn moments in the story of early creation. It was an act of cleansing, not erasure, a restoration, not punishment. Through the flood, the world released the weight it had carried, allowing a new foundation to form. The giant's downfall, though immense in its scale, fits within this larger purpose, part of a world returning to the order that had been strained beyond its limits. Their story closes not with condemnation, but with solemn recognition. The giants had arisen from a breach not of their making, lived in a world that grew darker around them, and fell in a cleansing they could not withstand. Their passing allowed creation to breathe again, to settle into a new beginning. The earth emerged renewed, the boundaries restored, and the memory of the giants' age carried forward as a reminder of the delicate balance upon which all life rests. When the waters of the great cleansing withdrew and the renewed earth rose from beneath their depths, it seemed for a time that the age of the giants had passed entirely into memory. Their towering forms, once woven into the trembling fabric of a world burdened by imbalance, had vanished beneath the tide of restoration. Yet the ancient writings speak of a quieter truth, one that moves gently through the early chapters of post-flood history. The echoes of the first giant age had not disappeared completely. In certain distant lands on the edges of early nations, there remained traces of the old presence, faint but unmistakable. These remnants were not like the giants who had walked before the flood. They did not bear the overwhelming scale of the first generation, nor the same vastness of strength. Their numbers were smaller, their stature less immense, yet still remarkable enough to mark them as distinct. They stood between memory and existence, living reminders of an age that had been cleansed, yet not entirely erased. Sacred writings describe these beings with a tone of calm recognition, noting their presence without alarm, as though acknowledging that some echoes linger even after the great turning of creation. These later giants, often referred to as remnants or later lineages, appeared in regions marked by ancient hills, high places, and fortresses whose foundations seemed older than the tribes who later dwelled near them. Some lived in lands bordered by steep ridges, others in cities strengthened by stonework that bore the imprint of unusual skill. Whether these structures were built by the remnants or merely inherited by them is not fully known. But their presence within such landscapes became part of the identity of those regions, shaping both story and memory. Their nature remained familiar to those who encountered them. Though smaller in number and stature than their predecessors, they carried the quiet heaviness of beings whose existence lay outside the ordinary rhythm of human life. Early communities approached them with caution, recognizing that these descendants of the first age bore traces of the same strength, the same solemnity, and the same restless spirit. Their presence did not unsettle the world in the same way, for the renewed earth carried a stability unknown in the days before the flood. Yet the remnants still stood apart, marked by origins deeper than the histories of the nations they lived among. Interactions between these giants and the early nations varied. In some regions, they lived on the outskirts, neither opposing nor assisting the people who settled nearby. In others, they became figures within the local stories, beings whose tall forms were seen from afar on the ridges or among the stones of ancient strongholds. There were moments of conflict, for their strength remained significant, and disputes of land or movement sometimes arose. But these conflicts did not resemble the vast turmoil of the earlier age. They were localized, brief, and tied more to circumstance than to the deeper imbalance that had once shaped the world. The remnants' influence extended into the shaping of early landscapes. Paths were carved around regions they inhabited. Villages were built at greater distance from high places known to be theirs. Terraces on steep hillsides, long forgotten in origin, became woven into stories connecting human settlement with the presence of these unusual tribes. Some traditions speak of valleys where crops grew with particular abundance, believed to have once been tended or cleared by giant hands. Other traditions speak of stones arranged in patterns whose meaning had faded, but whose existence testified to the presence of beings with strength beyond the ordinary. In many accounts, the remnants are described as both familiar and distant, familiar in their likeness to the giants of old, and distant in their separation from the forces that had once shaped the pre-flood world. Their existence in these narratives does not carry the weight of impending judgment. Rather, it reflects the quiet truth that not every echo of an age vanishes immediately when the age ends. Some traces linger, carried into new eras as reminders of what once had been. This intertwining of memory and presence shaped the stories of early nations. The remnants lived beside people who built their own histories, influencing their understanding of strength, of boundaries, and of the long reach of ancient days. The giants of the earlier age had embodied imbalance. The remnants embodied remembrance. Their existence did not unsettle creation's new harmony, but it stirred within humanity a deep awareness that the past remained connected to the present. Thus, the rise of these later tribes revealed that the world, though renewed, still carried faint impressions of its earlier chapters. The remnants walked through lands that bore ancient scars, and in doing so, they preserved the living connection between what create. Iron had been before the cleansing and what it had become after it. Their presence was not an interruption of the new order, but a quiet continuation of memory, a reminder that the great turning of the world does not fully erase what came before. As generations settled into the renewed world, the presence of the remnants became more clearly woven into the early histories of emerging nations. Their stature, though lesser than that of the giants who had walked before the flood, still set them apart. Their height surpassed that of ordinary people, their strength remained formidable, and their movements carried a gravity that hinted at origins older than the nations forming around them. Yet their influence did not spread with the overwhelming force seen in the First Age. Instead, it appeared in isolated regions, quiet, localized, and bound to specific landscapes. Many of the early nations recorded encounters with these remnants not as legends of terror, but as sober accounts of distant tribes who lived in fortified hills or high places. These regions were often rugged, marked by steep slopes, stone terraces, and ancient structures whose builders were unknown. Some believed the remnants themselves had shaped these places. Others believed they had inherited them from an even older past. In either case, the association between these beings and the land became inseparable. The geography of certain territories, its stones, its ridges, its defensive heights, seemed almost designed to reflect their presence. The remnants did not rule vast territories. They lived in clusters, sometimes forming small communities within mountain strongholds or secluded valleys. Their numbers remained limited, and their influence was shaped as much by their environment as by their strength. People living nearby learned to recognize the boundaries of these tribes, respecting the lands they claimed. Encounters were infrequent, shaped by caution but not always by hostility. The renewed earth carried a stability that softened the conflict that had marked earlier ages. Still, there were tensions. Early nations expanding into new lands sometimes found themselves crossing into regions inhabited by remnants. Disputes arose not from conquest, but from the natural pressures of migration and settlement. When conflict did occur, ancient texts describe it with a tone of solemnity. The remnants fought with the strength inherited from their lineage, but without the overwhelming dominance of their predecessors. The battles recorded in these accounts are not framed as great wars, but as struggles within a world still adjusting to the presence of beings who carried echoes of an earlier creation. Some traditions record specific tribes by name, people remembered for exceptional stature or strength. These groups, though fewer in number, left strong impressions upon the nations they encountered. Their names became woven into stories of borders, victories, and losses. Yet even in these accounts, the remnants are not portrayed as creatures of unrestrained violence. Their actions reflect the circumstances of their time, shaped by territorial tensions, survival, and the lingering complexity of their nature. The landscapes associated with these remnants held deep significance for nearby communities. Certain hills became places of caution, known as regions where giants once lived. Rocky highlands bore stones arranged in patterns the meaning of which had faded, but whose presence suggested deliberate placement. Families told stories of seeing tall figures moving along ridgelines at dusk, their silhouettes carrying the faint memory of the first giant age. These stories did not attempt to explain the nature of the remnants. They simply acknowledged their presence as part of the world. Within the remnants themselves, a quiet loneliness is suggested in the way traditions speak of them. They lived close to the land, distant from the nations forming around them. Their strength no longer ruled the world, yet it still set them apart. They belonged neither to the chaotic age before the flood nor fully to the renewed creation that followed. Their existence carried the weight of memory of a time when the boundary between realms had been breached, and when beings like them had walked the earth in great numbers. Their presence also influenced the stories of identity among human communities. Peoples who settled near lands known for giants often spoke of their own courage, their resilience, and the trials they survived. These narratives shaped their understanding of themselves, blending history with the quiet awe inspired by sharing the world with remnants of an older creation. The giants became part of the collective memory, not as beings of fear alone, but as markers of a broader story that extended beyond the lives of ordinary people. Over time, these later giants became woven into the cultural memory of nations. Their names appeared in genealogies, in territorial claims, and in accounts of ancient conflicts. Some were remembered as formidable opponents, others as figures encountered only in passing. Yet the tone of these memories remained reflective. The remnants were not viewed as threats to creation's order. They were viewed as part of a world still carrying traces of its earlier ages. Thus, the rise of these new tribes revealed that the echo of the first giant age had not fully faded. Though creation had been restored through the cleansing waters, the world retained a few subtle reminders of what had come before. The remnants lived as quiet symbols of continuity, bridging the divide between an age washed away and the renewed order that had taken its place. Their presence brought depth to the unfolding histories of early nations, reminding them that the earth held layers of story far older than their own beginnings. As the renewed world progressed through its early generations, the presence of the remnants became increasingly interwoven with the histories taking shape around them. Their numbers remained few, yet their significance endured. They were neither rulers nor conquerors. They were beings of memory, living traces of an age that the flood had washed away. Their existence carried a solemn reminder that creation, though restored, still held echoes of what had once strained its harmony. These remnants lived in regions that seemed shaped for them, lands where ancient stonework clung to steep ridges, where fortified hills rose in tiers carved long before written memory, and where deep valleys stretched like quiet corridors between high places. Whether these strongholds were crafted by the remnants themselves or inherited from a forgotten era, they became part of the identity of both the beings who lived among them and the nations that dwelled nearby. The land served as a witness, preserving footprints that time softened but never fully erased. Humanity encountered these remnants in ways shaped by caution and curiosity. Some early nations sought to avoid them, drawing boundaries around the territories they were known to inhabit. Others, through necessity or circumstance, approached them in trade or conflict. The outcomes of these encounters varied. In some accounts, the remnants acted with restraint, seeking neither dominance nor submission. In others, their strength led to confrontations that later became woven into the heroic narratives of early peoples. Yet even these accounts retain a reflective tone, acknowledging that the remnants acted not from a place of inherent malice, but from the tension of living between eras, shaped by the memory of a world that no longer existed. As generations passed, the stories surrounding these remnants became part of the cultural fabric of many regions. Children grew up hearing of tall figures glimpsed on distant ridges at dusk. Elders recounted tales of battles fought in ancient days, when their ancestors encountered tribes whose strength surpassed the ordinary. These stories, carried forward in calm voices, did not exaggerate the nature of the remnants. They portrayed them as beings whose presence demanded respect, but not fear. They were reminders of the vastness of creation's past, of the layers of story embedded within the earth. In some traditions, the remnants were linked to places marked by peculiar stones, formations rising in circles or rows that seemed too deliberate for chance. These stones, weathered by ages, became silent markers of the giants' lingering presence. Travelers paused before them, sensing a quiet gravity held within their arrangement. The remnants themselves were rarely seen among these stones, yet their association with such places persisted. These sites became symbols of continuity, connecting present generations to the memory of the world before the cleansing. Interactions between humanity and the remnants shaped more than stories. They influenced the movement of peoples, the formation of borders, and the perception of strength within early societies. Nations that settled near lands associated with giants often carried a sense of resilience, shaped by their proximity to beings who stood as living reminders of creation's earlier chapters. Even those who never encountered the remnants directly were influenced by the stories passed from neighboring peoples. In this way, the remnants played a quiet role in shaping the identity of entire regions. Yet the remnants themselves seemed to live with a sense of separateness. Their presence did not disrupt the stability of the renewed world, but neither did it fully belong to it. They walked through landscapes with a calm that suggested resignation, a recognition that their age had passed, and that they were but faint echoes of a story now closed. Some accounts describe them wandering more frequently as time moved on, as though searching for places where memory settled softly. Others depict them remaining within their strongholds, bound to the stones and hills that carried the lineage. Over time, their numbers grew smaller, whether through natural decline, separation from their origins, or simple isolation. The remnants gradually faded from the lands they once inhabited. Their departure did not announce itself. It unfolded quietly, in keeping with their role as shadows of an earlier world. Villages that once feared or respected them found their high places empty. Travelers who had glimpsed tall figures at dusk no longer saw silhouettes upon the ridges. The stones remained, the stories endured, but the beings themselves slipped gently into the margins of memory. Their fading did not silence their significance. The remnants left an imprint on the earth, an imprint carried not through monuments alone, but through the awareness they instilled. Early nations remembered them as beings shaped by an age that preceded their own, beings connected to the deep history of creation. The remnants taught the world that even after restoration, traces of earlier imbalance could linger, not to disrupt the new order, but to remind later generations of the delicate harmony upon which life rests. Thus, The rise of the new tribes and the presence of the remnants form a bridge between the world before the flood and the world that followed. Their existence reveals that creation's story does not progress in isolation. It carries forward echoes, memory, and the quiet remnants of ages long past. And though these later giants would eventually fade from the world, their presence shaped the early histories of nations, leaving behind a solemn reminder that even renewal bears traces of what came before. As the world moved further from the days of the remnants, creation entered an era shaped not by the presence of giants, but by the memory of them. The towering figures who once walked through valleys and across ancient hills had faded into silence, yet their story lived on in the consciousness of the nations that followed. It was into this landscape of remembrance that the prophets began to speak, voices raised not in fear, but in calm authority, calling attention to the lessons carried forward from ages long past. The prophets did not dwell upon the giants directly. Their messages rarely spoke of towering forms or distant tribes. Instead, they drew upon the memory of the giants as a symbol, an image that captured the truth of boundaries crossed, of strength untempered by wisdom, and of the consequences that followed when creation drifted from the balance set for it. To mention the giants was to invoke a quiet warning, a reminder that even the mightiest beings could fall when their path diverged from the order woven into the world. These prophetic warnings were gentle, yet firm. They did not stir fear or exaggerate the past. They guided their listeners toward reflection. The prophets understood that the story of the giants was not simply a record of ancient beings, but a testimony to the fragility of human strength. The giants had possessed power beyond anything the prophets' audiences could imagine, yet they had been swept away in the cleansing that restored the earth. Their downfall illustrated that no strength, however great, could stand apart from the boundaries that shaped creation. Across the prophetic writings, the memory of the giants appears in brief phrases, in quiet allusions, in names that evoke entire histories with a single breath. These references are seldom expanded, for the prophets trusted their listeners to know the meaning carried within them. When a prophet mentioned the land once inhabited by giants, the audience heard not only geography, but the echo of an age when strength alone could not preserve life. When a prophet spoke of nations rising in pride, the memory of the giants stood behind the warning, reminding all who listened that power without restraint leads inevitably to decline. The tone of these prophetic words remained calm. They did not rebuke with anger. They did not stir their audiences through dramatic recounting. Instead, they invited reflection through the steady recounting of truths already known. The giants served as quiet examples, their story woven into the deeper teachings of humility, obedience, and the necessity of boundaries. Their memory showed that the world itself responds to imbalance, and that judgment, when it comes, is part of a larger restoration. For the prophets, the ancient past was not distant. It was a guide. The events that had shaped earlier ages were woven into the lessons needed for their own time. The giants became part of this tapestry, a symbol reminding humanity that strength without alignment leads to instability, and that creation carries within itself the memory of what brings harmony and what disturbs it. Thus, the prophets' quiet warnings did not portray the giants as monstrous beings. They portrayed them as reflections of paths once taken and of the consequences that followed. By recalling them, the prophets urged their listeners to walk with care, to honor the boundaries set at the beginning, and to live within the harmony intended for the world. As prophetic voices continued to arise across generations, their words returned again and again to the ancient past, not to awaken fear, but to anchor understanding. They spoke of former ages the way one might speak of distant mountains on the horizon, steady, solemn, and unchanging. The memory of the giants remained one of those distant peaks, visible from afar, shaping the moral landscape of every people who knew the old stories. The prophets understood that the past carried wisdom, and that what had once happened upon the earth remained a guide for interpreting the fragile paths of the present. In their teachings, the prophets often pointed to moments when creation itself had responded to imbalance. They reminded their listeners of the flood, not as a tale of devastation, but as a moment when the world was restored. And within that restoration lay the quiet memory of the giants, beings whose strength could not save them when creation sought to heal itself. The prophets used this memory with gentleness, allowing it to speak for itself. They understood that a story carried in silence often teaches more deeply than one retold in dramatic detail. Their warnings, therefore, were shaped by calm restraint. When they spoke of pride rising within nations, they did so with the knowledge that the giants had once embodied a similar elevation. When they spoke of boundaries being ignored or wisdom being set aside, they did so with the remembrance that such patterns had once led the world into balance. Their messages wove these truths quietly into the hearts of their audiences. The giant's story became an anchor for understanding that power, when severed from guidance, becomes unstable, and that creation possesses a memory of order deeper than human intent. The prophets also spoke of the fragility of human strength. Though humanity possessed no form comparable to the giants, the prophets reminded their listeners that fragility often lies not in the body but in the heart. The giants had possessed bodies that seemed immovable, yet they had fallen. Their downfall revealed that the stability of life depends not upon might but upon alignment with the boundaries that hold creation together. The prophets shared this lesson gently, teaching that humility protects, while pride exposes. Their listeners would have understood the reference clearly, for the memory of the ancient tribes was woven into the soil and stone of the lands they inhabited. In many prophetic writings, the giants appear almost as shadows, figures mentioned briefly as context, as comparison, or as subtle warning. A prophet might describe a nation as mighty as those of old, and the audience would recall the ancient beings whose might had not preserved them. Another prophet might refer to lands where giants once dwelled, and the people would understand that such lands bore a history deeper than their own. These small references carried weight, for they connected the present to the long memory of the earth. The prophets trusted this memory. They did not need to recount the full stories of the giants to make their point. They understood that the echo of the past remained alive in the consciousness of their people. The giants had become symbols, not of terror, but of consequence. Their presence in prophetic discourse reminded listeners that even the greatest strength is bound to the conditions of creation, and that stepping beyond those conditions leads to a natural rebalancing. At times, the prophets spoke directly of boundaries of conduct, of devotion, of wisdom. The memory of the giants stood behind these teachings like a quiet figure in the distance. The prophets taught that boundaries existed not to constrain life, but to protect it. The giant's story illustrated that life without boundaries grows unstable, and that power without guidance leads to decay. These lessons were offered not with harshness, but with calm clarity. The prophets understood that the gentlest warnings often reach the furthest. Their messages also emphasized the interconnectedness of past and present. The world, they taught, was shaped by patterns, and these patterns repeated across ages. The story of the giants revealed one such pattern, a pattern of strength rising without balance, of knowledge spreading without wisdom, and of creation responding to restore harmony. The prophets urged their listeners to learn from this pattern, to live in alignment with the ancient order rather than strain against it. In this way, the giants remained present in the prophetic imagination, not as immediate threats, but as reminders of what creation remembers. Their story whispered through the prophetic warnings, telling of a time when power overshadowed purpose and when the earth itself rose to cleanse the imbalance. The prophets, in recalling these truths, offered their listeners a path grounded in reflection, a path that honored the lessons carried forward through generations. As the prophetic tradition unfolded across centuries, the memory of the giants continued to serve as a quiet thread woven through teachings meant to guide humanity toward steadiness. The prophets spoke into their own troubled times, periods marked by rising kingdoms, shifting loyalties, and the constant pull of human desire. Yet their voices always reached farther back than the concerns of the present moment. They drew from the deep well of ancient history, where the story of the giants rested as a solemn reminder of the patterns that shape creation. In their final reflections on the ancient past, the prophets often spoke of the world as a place governed by rhythms older than any nation. These rhythms did not erase human freedom, but they framed it. The giants, whose strength had once overshadowed whole regions, became an example of what occurs when life grows out of rhythm with the order intended for it. Their downfall illustrated that no being, whether born of earth, shaped by knowledge, or possessing great power, could stand against the restoration that creation brings when imbalance deepens beyond repair. The prophets used this memory not to provoke alarm, but to instill understanding. They reminded their listeners that creation itself responds to the conduct of those who dwell within it. Just as the giants had influenced the earth through their might and their actions, so too could nations influence the stability of their times. Pride could unsettle the land, injustice could disturb its foundatio. And violence could set forces in motion that no army could restrain. The prophets offered these truths with steady voices, urging communities to consider how their choices aligned with the ancient order. In their teachings, the prophets often contrasted the fragility of human strength with the enduring stability of divine boundaries. The giants, though formidable, had fallen, not because they were weak, but because they had lived outside the balance that sustains creation. This contrast became a central part of the prophetic message. The prophets encouraged humility, not as a burden but as a safeguard. They reminded leaders and common people alike that strength grounded in alignment endures, while strength grounded in ambition falters. Some prophetic writings speak of nations rising like the mighty ones of old, using the memory of the giants as a way to caution against arrogance. These allusions were not threats. They were gentle reminders that power, however impressive, does not stand alone. It must rest upon a foundation shaped by justice, restraint, and reverence for the order of creation. The giants had lacked such a foundation, and their story offered a quiet warning to every generation that followed. The prophets also recognized the deep influence of memory upon the human heart. They understood that stories shape perception, and that the memory of the giants carried a weight that could guide or mislead depending on how it was held. Therefore, they spoke carefully, ensuring that their references pointed toward wisdom rather than curiosity. They invoked the past not to stir fascination with ancient beings, but to illuminate the path of balance in the present. The giants served as shadows along that path, shadows that showed where misaligned strength could lead. In this way, the prophetic warnings became a bridge between ages. The giants belonged to a distant era, yet their story continued to inform the unfolding of later histories. Their memory taught that the world is not shaped by strength alone, but by the alignment of strength with order. It taught that creation remembers harmony, and that whenever harmony is strained, the world responds in ways both subtle and profound. As prophetic voices looked toward the future, they carried with them the lessons of the past. They urged the people to remember the ancient boundaries, to honor the balance set at the beginning, and to walk with humility before the forces that sustain life. The giants, though long gone, remained part of this teaching, reminders carved into the memory of the earth, guiding those who listened with attentive hearts. In the end, the prophets did not speak of the giants as beings to fear or revere. They spoke of them as part of a larger truth, that the world holds a delicate balance, and that life flourishes when it abides within that balance. Their quiet warnings echoed across the generations, inviting reflection, not dread. Through these teachings, the ancient past became a steady companion to the present, offering guidance through the story of those who once walked upon the earth with strength unmatched, yet whose fate showed that strength alone is never enough. In the slow unfolding of the renewed world, the remnants of the giant tribes began to pass quietly into the background of history. Their presence, once unmistakable in the landscapes they inhabited, grew rarer with each generation. They had never been many in the years after the flood, and as nations rose and spread across the earth, their numbers diminished further. There was no single event that marked their departure. Instead, their fading occurred as gently as mist withdrawing from the hills at dawn, subtle, gradual, and without struggle. The lands that had once held their strongholds remained, shaped by stones arranged in patterns older than memory. Terraced slopes, towering ridges, and quiet valleys carried faint traces of their presence. Travelers who passed through these regions spoke of a feeling that lingered in the air, a sense that the land held stories deeper than the histories written by human hands. The giants themselves were seldom seen, yet the earth preserved the marks of their footsteps. These marks became the last witness to their existence, carrying a quiet reverence that outlasted the beings who had made them. The early nations that settled near these regions regarded the remnants with a mixture of respect and solemn curiosity. But as time passed, encounters grew rare. The giants withdrew further into remote places, their great forms glimpsed only from afar, or not at all. Some traditions suggest that they wandered into wilderness regions where few humans traveled. Others describe them settling into seclusion within ancient ruins, as though choosing to dwell where memory was stronger than the present. Whatever path they took, their presence drifted from the life of the world, becoming a distant echo rather than a living force. This fading did not bring fear or confusion. It carried instead a sense of quiet closure. The giants had belonged to an earlier age, an age marked by imbalance, heavy knowledge, and the need for restoration. The renewed world that followed the flood had no place for their overwhelming presence, and so their departure occurred as part of creation's natural rhythm, a gentle unwinding of a thread no longer needed in the tapestry of the earth. In sacred memory, silence often holds as much meaning as sound. The prophets spoke through words, but creation often speaks through stillness. As the giants vanished from daily life, silence settled around their story, a silence that carried depth, not emptiness. This silence became part of sacred history, reminding later generations that some chapters conclude not with sudden endings, but with the soft fading of shapes into the distance. Communities built new dwellings upon lands that had once been avoided. Fields were planted in valleys where giants had once walked. Children grew up unaware that their footsteps echoed those of beings far greater than themselves. Yet in certain places, near old stones, along high ridges, beside ancient walls, people felt a quiet gravity. They sensed that the land held memories they could not fully understand, memories of a people whose time had passed but whose presence had not been fully erased. Thus, the fading of the giants became a gentle chapter in the story of the world. Their departure did not disrupt the order restored after the flood. It affirmed it. Their absence marked the completion of a process begun in the days of cleansing, a process through which creation separated itself from the imbalance that had once strained it. In the silence that followed, the renewed earth rested, holding within its stones and valleys the last whispers of a people who had once walked with immense strength, yet whose story had reached its natural end. As generations continued to rise and fall, the remnants of the giants became figures spoken of more in memory than in sight. Their presence, once woven into the daily awareness of nearby communities, slowly withdrew beyond the edges of ordinary life. The gradual nature of their fading meant that no single generation could clearly mark when they had last been seen. Instead, stories shifted from accounts of rare encounters to recollections of what elders had once heard, and eventually to whispers of an age long gone. The lands they had inhabited began to take on new meanings. Valleys once associated with their wanderings now bore the marks of farms and settlements. Forests that had grown quiet in their presence now echoed with the sounds of human life. Stone fortresses on ancient hills, once believed to shelter their clans, became ruins studied with curiosity by later peoples. These structures, weathered by wind and time, stood as silent monuments to a history that had slipped beyond living memory. The stones did not reveal their builders, yet their size and arrangement carried the faint echo of those who had once shaped them. In the absence of the giants themselves, the landscapes they left behind held a quiet authority. Travelers who stood among the old stones of ten spoke of a stillness that seemed older than the world they knew, a stillness that suggested a presence now gone. These impressions were not born of fear, but of reverence. The giants had not vanished through conflict, nor had they been driven away. Their departure reflected the natural passing of an age whose work was complete. The world no longer strained under their weight, and creation had settled into a harmony that did not require their presence. Stories about them continued to shift as the centuries unfolded. What had once been memory became legend, and what had been legend slowly softened into symbol. The giants came to represent the distant past, an era when the boundaries of creation were first tested, when strength and imbalance walked side by side. The prophets had used their story as a reminder, and now the storytellers of later generations used their memory as a way to understand the earth itself. The giants were no longer spoken of as warriors or wanderers. They were spoken of as figures who belonged to the deep history of the world, as ancient as the stones and ridges that still bore their shape. With their fading came a new silence, a silence that deepened the peace of the renewed world. This silence did not erase their presence, it preserved it. Through absence, their story gained clarity. Their lives, once intertwined with the unrest and imbalance of the pre-flood age, stood now as a completed chapter. Their passing made room for new histories, the formation of nations, the rise of cities, and the slow unfolding of human culture. These developments took root in a world no longer overshadowed by the weight of beings too great for its restored harmony. Yet the silence held more than memory. It became a teaching. In the calm left behind by the giants' departure, people learned to understand that not all power remains, and not all stories continue beyond their proper season. The giants had lived at the edge of boundaries, and their existence had revealed the consequences of crossing them. Now, through silence, creation affirmed that some stories end precisely when they must, making room for the world to continue without their presence. Thus, the fading of the giants was not felt as loss. It was felt as completion. Their time had passed quietly into the folds of the earth's long memory, and the world moved forward in peace. The silence that followed their departure held the weight of ages, offering itself as a reflection for those who paused to listen. As the last traces of the giant tribe slipped deeper into the margins of memory, the world entered a quiet stage of reflection. Nations grew, spread, and changed, yet in certain moments and places, the thought of the giants lingered like a distant echo. Their absence, more than their presence, began to shape how later generations understood the history of the earth. It was in this silence, soft, pervasive, and enduring, that the story of the giants found its final meaning. The fading of a people is rarely recorded with clarity. Instead, it is sensed through what remains and what no longer appears. So it was with the giants. Travelers journeyed across mountains that earlier peoples had feared, finding no signs of the great figures once seen upon the ridges. Shepherds who tended their flocks in once avoided valleys found only the wind moving through the grass. Ancient strongholds perched upon hills, though massive in their foundations, held no footprints, no markings, no voices carried upon the air. The world felt lighter because of this quiet, and the absence itself became a presence. Over time, this silence grew into a component of sacred history. The giants, who had once stood as symbols of imbalance and ancient power, now stood as symbols of closure. Their disappearance marked the natural conclusion of a story that had begun in ages when boundaries were first broken. Their passing did not remove their significance. Rather, it allowed their story to settle into its proper place within the long arc of creation, no longer active, no longer shaping the world, but remembered as a completed chapter. In many traditions, silence is a form of testimony. It speaks not through words, but through the stillness that follows events of great magnitude. The silence left by the giants testified that judgment had accomplished its purpose, that restoration had taken root, and that the earth now lived under a calmer sky. The giants' departure confirmed that their era belonged to a world that no longer existed. What remained was the peace that follows correction, the calm that settles after a long and heavy storm. Nations built their histories upon this peace. They tilled the soil of valleys once shaped by giant hands. They built walls and dwellings upon ancient foundations. They told stories around fires, recounting what their ancestors had whispered, tales of beings taller than trees, stronger than stone, beings who had walked the earth in days when the world was still young. These stories, though softened by time, retained a reverent tone. The giants were not remembered as monsters, nor were they glorified. They were remembered as parts of the earth's deep history, figures whose story revealed truths larger than themselves. As the centuries passed, even the stories began to dim. The old stones remained, but their meaning grew uncertain. Valleys once named for giants were called by new names. Cities rose where forests had grown, covering the land with new layers of memory. Yet beneath all the change, beneath the movements of nations and the shaping of cultures, the silence remained. It lay like a gentle foundation beneath all later histories, reminding those who sought wisdom that strength rises and falls, that imbalance does not endure, and that creation preserves the lessons of the past through both presence and absence. The fading of the giants prepared the world for quieter meditations. With their story closed, humanity turned its attention to the unfolding of its own path. The earth no longer carried the weight of their steps. Instead, it carried the peaceful rhythm of life renewed. The silence that followed the giants invited contemplation, not of fear, but of balance, humility, and the enduring wisdom embedded within creation. Thus, the story of the giants ends in quietness, not in conflict, not in catastrophe, but in the gentle passing of a people whose time had reached its proper conclusion. Their silence became their final gift to the world, a reminder that some stories speak most clearly when they come to rest, and that peace often follows when the weight of an age is lifted. In the stillness that rests upon the final pages of sacred memory, the story of the giant tribes returns, not as a tale of ancient power, but as a quiet reflection upon why their days were marked at all. Their presence shaped only a portion of the early world, yet their significance extends far beyond the years in which they walked upon the earth. Their rise, their wandering, their burdens, and their eventual fading form a pattern woven into the deeper fabric of creation, a pattern that speaks of boundary, order, mercy, and the steady restoration that follows imbalance. To understand the meaning of their days is to listen to the gentle rhythm beneath all sacred history, where every rise prepares for a settling, and every weight finds its place within a greater design. The story of the giants begins with a boundary crossed, when watchers stepped beyond the limits set for them and imparted knowledge not meant for the early earth. From that boundary, The giants entered the world as beings shaped by both realms yet belonging fully to neither. Their lives revealed what occurs when strength is born from imbalance, when power arises without the harmony that sustains it. They carried within them the consequences of a moment when creation's order was strained. Their size, their force, and their wandering presence all spoke of a world learning the cost of broken limits. Yet the giants were not merely signs of imbalance. They were also signs of mercy. Their days, though marked, were allowed to unfold across generations. They walked the earth long enough for humanity to see clearly the nature of strength that stands apart from purpose. They lived long enough for creation to reveal that power, when lifted above balance, becomes heavy not only for those who encounter it, but for the world itself. Their story gave space for understanding to deepen, for reflection to form, and for the truth to settle. Strength alone cannot sustain a world out of harmony. When the time of restoration arrived and the flood swept across the ancient earth, the passing of the giants revealed another truth. That judgment in sacred history is not destruction, but cleansing. Their end was not written in anger. It was written in the same care that guides the renewal of all creation. Through their story, the world learned that boundaries exist not to limit life, but to protect it. And when boundaries are broken, restoration becomes an act of mercy, not only for humanity, but for the world itself. As the renewed earth moved into later ages, the memory of the giants remained. Their presence lingered in the stones of ancient hills, in valleys shaped by steps greater than human stride, and in the quiet stories passed through generations. Their memory guided prophets, shaped the caution of nations, and offered a lens through which the past could be understood. Their story, though completed, continued to teach gently. That strength without alignment grows unstable, that creation remembers its own order, and that every age carries echoes of what came before. Thus, the meaning of their days rests not in their power, nor in their downfall, but in the quiet wisdom carried through their rise and their fading. They remind the world that creation moves according to deep rhythms, that mercy often comes in the form of restoration, and that ancient stories endure because they offer guidance without force. In remembering the giants, later generations learn to walk with humility, to honor boundaries, and to rest in the stillness that follows understanding. As reflection deepens upon the days of the ancient giants, their story reveals itself not as an isolated tale, but as part of a broader pattern woven through sacred history. Each age carries its own imprint, yet the giants stand as a distinct reminder of how creation responds when strength rises outside the boundaries meant to guide it. Their presence on the earth illuminated truths that extend far beyond their own generation, truths the prophets later echoed, and truths that continue to settle quietly within the contemplations of those who look back upon the earliest ages. The giants embodied a form of greatness that lacked anchoring. Their height, their might, and the knowledge granted to them created beings of extraordinary power, beings who stood apart from the ordinary rhythm of human life. Yet their story shows that power, however vast, cannot flourish without harmony. The giants struggled not because they were mighty, but because their might arose from a broken foundation. Their nature pulled in two directions, toward earth, where they walked, and toward the heavens, whose boundaries they embodied but could never reach. This tension shaped their lives and foreshadowed their end, revealing that strength rooted in imbalance eventually becomes too heavy for the world to bear. The passing of the giants through the flood stands within this pattern of restoration. The cleansing that swept across the earth was not dire. Seated at them alone. It addressed the full spectrum of imbalance that had filled the ancient world: human corruption, the misuse of knowledge, the spreading of violence, and the strain upon creation itself. In this vast restoration, the end of the giants became a symbol of completion. Their days had served their purpose. They had shown the world what strength unbounded by wisdom becomes, and they had prepared creation to recognize the necessity of order renewed. After the flood, the smaller tribes of later giants served as reminders, not successors. Their presence, though notable, no longer bore the same weight. They stood as echoes of the first age, not as figures shaping the new one. And as they, too, faded into memory, the world retained the lessons their existence offered. Sacred texts carried these lessons with calm clarity. They spoke of the giants not to elevate them, but to trace the long arc of consequence and mercy that guided creation. This arc reveals a deeper truth, that heaven marked the days of the giants not as a record of power, but as a lesson in balance. Their rise displayed the fragility of creation when boundaries are crossed. Their fall displayed the mercy inherent in restoration. Their days illustrate the principle found across ages, that the world thrives when it remains aligned with the order set at its beginning, and that even great strength must rest upon that order to endure. The story of the giants also teaches the quiet endurance of memory. Though their presence vanished, their echo shaped the understanding of generations. Prophets invoked their story in passing, knowing that the mention of ancient beings of immense stature would call forth reflections on humility, restraint, and the consequences of forgetting the earliest patterns. Parents told their children not only of the giants' might, but of their fall, imparting the lesson that endurance belongs not to those who are strongest, but to those who walk within the boundaries that sustain creation. Through these teachings, the giants became guides in absence. Their silence spoke as clearly as their strength once had. The stones that bore their mark, the valleys shaped by their movement, and the quiet stories passed through generations all carried the same message: that harmony is the foundation of endurance, and that even the greatest beings falter when cut off from that harmony. Thus, the long echo of their strength extends not through feats of might, but through the wisdom carried forward. Their story encourages later generations to look upon power with understanding, to treat knowledge with humility, and to recognize the deep link between order and life. It invites a calm reflection on the nature of existence, reminding all who ponder the ancient past that every age rests upon the choices of its people, and that the road to balance is often shaped by the lessons of those who walked before. As the contemplation of their story draws toward its close, the meaning of the giants' days settles into quiet clarity. Their presence upon the earth, though immense in scale and striking in form, now appears as a single strand within the vast tapestry of sacred history, a strand that teaches more through its completion than through its unfolding. Their rise reveals the fragile beauty of creation's order. Their fall reveals the gentleness of restoration. And their fading reveals how the world moves forward when an age has given all it was meant to give. The giants stand as reminders that creation carries both memory and purpose. The boundaries broken in their origin teach that harmony requires reverence. The imbalance that shaped their nature teaches that strength must be guided. The judgment that ended their age teaches that correction is part of mercy. And the silence that followed teaches that peace often begins where noise once reigned. Through their story, the world is invited to see that every era, whether marked by might or humility, finds its meaning within the larger rhythm of creation's unfolding. What remains of the giants is not their height, nor their feats, nor the legends that later generations embellished. What remains is the wisdom carried through their story, that life must remain aligned with the order woven into its foundation, that knowledge must be tempered with humility, that power must rest upon purpose, and that creation itself responds when these truths are set aside. The giants' strength did not preserve them, but their story preserves a lesson that endures across ages. In reflecting upon their days, a calm truth emerges. Heaven did not mark their time to elevate them, but to guide those who would come after. Their existence serves as a mirror in which later generations may see the consequences of imbalance and the necessity of restoration. The prophets understood this. The storytellers of later ages understood it as well. They spoke of the giants not to awaken fear, but to awaken understanding, to remind their listening that even the greatest beings walk within the boundaries set for creation, and that peace arises when those boundaries are honored. The giants also reveal the quiet mercy that permeates sacred history. Though born from a breach, they were allowed to live out their days. Though shaped by imbalance, they were woven into the learning of the world. And though their era ended in the flood, their memory was carried forward gently, preserved in writings that speak without harshness. This mercy reveals itself in the way their story continues to guide reflection, offering a path toward humility and reverence rather than dread. As the long echo of their strength fades into stillness, the world is left not with fear but with peace. The story that began with the Watchers turning and moved through the giants wandering concludes in a quiet confidence that creation knows its own order and tends toward balance. The giants' days, once filled with movement and weight, now rest within the repose of memory. Their presence shaped the earliest ages. Their absence shapes the understanding of later ones. In this final reflection, the tone settles into stillness. The giants no longer walk the earth, yet the lessons of their existence remain steady and clear. Their story teaches that life unfolds best within the harmony of its design, and that even the mightiest beings cannot stand apart from the rhythms that sustain creation. It teaches that every age, no matter how distant, speaks quietly to those who listen, offering guidance through its rise, its turning, and its completion. And so the narrative of the giants ends where all sacred stories ultimately rest, in a place of calm understanding, where ancient strength becomes gentle instruction, and where the echo of earlier ages softens into a steady peace. Through their story, the heart is invited into stillness, and the mind finds a quiet path toward rest.